Hello, my sleepy heads. It's good to have you back. Tonight, we'll travel far beyond the modern world to the earliest heart of Mesoamerican civilization, a land of rivers, forests, and fertile plains where the first monumental cities arose and where humankind learned to carve stone, build ceremonial centers, and organize society. This is the story of the Olmecs, the pioneers of ritual, art, and urban life in ancient America. But before we begin, I just want to thank you for being here. If these quiet journeys through time bring you peace or help you drift into rest, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's return to the world of the Olmecs. The origins of the Olmec civilization can be traced to the tropical lowlands along the Gulf Coast of present-day Mexico, particularly within the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco. Between approximately 1500 and 1200 BCE, scattered agricultural villages began to coalesce into increasingly complex social networks, forming the earliest recognizable centers of Olmec culture. Archaeological evidence indicates that these communities relied on fertile alluvial plains along rivers such as the Quetzalcoatlus, which provided reliable water sources, nutrient-rich soils, and transportation routes facilitating trade and communication. Early Olmec settlements demonstrate an adaptive approach to the tropical environment, employing raised fields and seasonal cultivation techniques to maximize yields of staple crops including maize, beans, squash, and manioc. Analysis of pollen samples and carbonized botanical remains confirms that these crops formed the dietary foundation of early Olmec populations, supporting gradual population growth and settlement aggregation. The strategic selection of settlement locations indicates an awareness of both environmental advantages and potential threats from flooding, while also facilitating access to valuable natural resources such as basalt, jade, and magnetite for tool production and ritual use. These initial settlements, while relatively small, display signs of social differentiation that foreshadow the hierarchical organization of later Olmec centers. Excavations at sites such as San Lorenzo have revealed clusters of domestic structures interspersed with elevated platforms and communal spaces. Such arrangements suggest the presence of emerging social elites capable of organizing labor for shared construction projects and managing communal resources. These early leaders likely exercised both economic and religious authority, as evidenced by the spatial association of elite residences with ceremonial platforms and ritual deposits. The existence of carved figurines, miniature altars, and other symbolic objects in early contexts indicates that ritual practice was already central to community cohesion. These artifacts demonstrate both technical skill and symbolic awareness, suggesting that ideological frameworks were developing concurrently with practical governance structures. By organizing labor for agricultural management and communal construction, these early villages inadvertently established patterns that would evolve into one of Mesoamerica's first formalized political systems. The rise of San Lorenzo as a prominent early center provides critical insight into the mechanisms of social organization and urban development within the Olmec heartland. Radiocarbon dating indicates that the site achieved prominence around 1200 BCE, though occupation likely began several centuries earlier. Extensive archaeological investigation reveals monumental constructions composed of local clay and imported basalt, including large earthen mounds and elevated plazas. These constructions required coordinated labor involving hundreds, if not thousands, of workers over extended periods. Quarrying operations at distant basalt outcrops, some located more than 50 kilometers from the settlement, demonstrate logistical planning and the capacity for long-range resource mobilization. The transportation of multi-ton stones via river networks or overland routes represents one of the earliest examples of large-scale engineering in Mesoamerica. These monumental projects served not only functional purposes, such as drainage or platform creation, but also symbolized emerging elite authority. The ability to organize, sustain, and justify such labor-intensive undertakings suggests that leadership in early Olmec society rested upon both administrative skill and ideological sanction. Trade and exchange networks were another foundational component of early Olmec development. Archaeological analysis of exotic materials recovered from San Lorenzo, such as jade, obsidian, and magnetite, indicates connections to distant highland regions and the Guatemalan Pacific slope. These materials were not only functional, but also held ceremonial and symbolic significance, often being incorporated into figurines, ceremonial axes, or personal adornment for elites. The presence of these imported goods within elite contexts underscores the importance of long-distance trade in establishing status and reinforcing social hierarchies. Moreover, the distribution of Olmec-style artifacts at sites outside the heartland, including in Oaxaca and the Valley of Mexico, demonstrates that early Olmec influence extended through prestige exchange and ideological dissemination rather than through military conquest. These networks allowed the circulation of both tangible goods and intangible cultural elements, facilitating the establishment of a recognizable Olmec identity across a wide geographical region. Agriculture, settlement expansion, and trade collectively contributed to a marked increase in social complexity during this formative period. Evidence from San Lorenzo and nearby villages indicates the emergence of specialized craft production, including ceramic manufacture, stone carving, and the creation of ritual objects. Standardization in form and style suggests the presence of artisans working under elite supervision or within household workshops that supplied ceremonial and domestic needs. The concentration of production in specific areas, combined with surplus agricultural output, enabled communities to support non-farming specialists and maintain large-scale public works. In turn, this reinforced social stratification, with elites maintaining control over labor, resources, and ritual practice. The integration of economic, administrative, and ritual responsibilities within early settlements demonstrates that the Olmecs were developing the structural foundations necessary for sustained urbanization and regional influence. Ceremonial practice played a central role in consolidating authority and fostering social cohesion during the early formative phase. Excavations reveal that ritual deposits often accompany architectural construction, including caches of jade figurines, polished stone celts, and other offerings placed beneath platforms and mounds. Such practices indicate that public rituals were not merely symbolic, but were intertwined with political authority, reinforcing the power of emerging elites. The orientation of plazas, ceremonial platforms, and processional pathways suggests careful planning to accommodate gatherings and ritual activities that involved large portions of the population. These ritualized activities likely served multiple functions, from legitimizing elite leadership to regulating agricultural cycles, marking seasonal events, and reinforcing cosmological beliefs. By embedding authority within ceremonial practice, the early Olmecs were able to maintain social order and establish a shared cultural framework that would endure and expand in subsequent centuries. Over the next centuries, San Lorenzo evolved into a more complex urban center, with evidence of expanded monumental architecture, greater stratification of residential spaces, and increasingly sophisticated hydraulic engineering. Canals, reservoirs, and raised causeways facilitated both agricultural productivity and urban planning, while reinforcing elite oversight of resources and labor. The coordination required to maintain these systems implies the existence of a managerial class capable of organizing construction, directing labor, and sustaining ceremonial schedules. Such organizational capacity enabled the Olmecs to support larger populations and to assert influence over surrounding regions through trade, ideology, and cultural integration. In this way, the formative period set in motion processes of social, political, and economic consolidation that would define the Olmec civilization during its peak at La Venta and other major centers. The combination of environmental adaptation, social hierarchy, ritual practice, and regional interaction during this early phase highlights the Olmecs' innovative approach to complex society. By leveraging fertile river valleys, developing sophisticated craft and trade systems, and embedding authority within ideological frameworks, these early communities created a model for long-term regional dominance. The patterns established during this period, the integration of economic management, ceremonial authority, and monumental expression, would recur throughout the civilization's development, influencing both contemporaneous neighbors and later Mesoamerican societies. The formative settlements of the Gulf Coast, particularly San Lorenzo, therefore represent not only the beginnings of Olmec culture, but also the foundations of urbanized, centralized, and ideologically cohesive civilization in Mesoamerica. These developments naturally lead into the next stage of Olmec history, characterized by the rise of La Venta as the primary ceremonial and political center. The lessons learned from early environmental adaptation, social organization, and trade management provided the structural and ideological framework upon which the Olmecs could expand their influence, construct monumental architecture on an unprecedented scale, and consolidate regional power. Understanding this early period is essential for contextualizing the subsequent achievements and innovations that define the Olmec civilization at its height. The development of La Venta as the central Olmec ceremonial and political hub marks a critical stage in the evolution of this early Mesoamerican civilization. Situated on a slightly elevated plateau near the modern city of Villahermosa in Tabasco, La Venta emerged around 1000 BCE, following the gradual decline of San Lorenzo. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site was deliberately planned, with large earthen mounds, artificial terraces, and structured plazas serving as focal points for political, religious, and social activities. Radiocarbon dating of construction layers confirms continuous occupation and monumental building over several centuries, reflecting both the sustained influence of elite rulers and the capacity for coordinated labor management. The site's location provided access to fertile floodplains for agriculture, as well as proximity to rivers that facilitated the transportation of basalt, jade, and other exotic materials essential for craft production and ceremonial purposes. This strategic positioning demonstrates the Olmecs' understanding of geography, resource availability, and the logistical requirements for supporting a complex urban center. Monumental construction at La Venta provides insight into the organizational sophistication of the Olmec elite. The Great Pyramid, composed of clay, sand, and stone fill, rises approximately 30 meters above the surrounding plain, creating a prominent visual marker and ceremonial platform. Excavations reveal that the pyramid was built in successive stages, each layer reflecting careful planning, labor coordination, and long-term commitment to architectural projects. Surrounding plazas accommodated public gatherings, processions, and ritual ceremonies, underscoring the integration of civic, religious, and social functions. The construction of such monumental structures required not only manual labor, but also managerial expertise in resource allocation, workforce mobilization, and scheduling. The transportation of massive basalt blocks from quarries located more than 60 kilometers away illustrates the logistical ingenuity of the Olmecs. These undertakings reveal that leadership at La Venta combined administrative, ritual, and ideological authority, enabling rulers to organize large-scale projects that reinforced social cohesion and elite status. Artistic expression at La Venta reflects both technical mastery and ideological sophistication. The site is renowned for its colossal heads, each carved from a single basalt boulder and measuring up to 3 meters in height. These heads, widely interpreted as representations of elite rulers, exhibit individualized features, headgear, and expressions, suggesting an emphasis on personal identity and authority. Alongside the colossal heads, the site contains thrones, altars, and stelae with intricate carvings depicting ritual scenes, supernatural beings, and symbolic motifs such as the word jaguar. These works demonstrate the Olmecs' ability to convey complex ideological messages through visual language. Smaller artifacts, including jade figurines, polished stone celts, and ceramic objects, indicate that ritual and symbolic practice permeated both public and private spheres. The integration of monumental and portable art at La Venta reflects a comprehensive ideological system linking leadership, ritual authority, and social hierarchy. Archaeological analysis of residential patterns at La Venta provides additional insight into social organization. Excavations reveal a clear differentiation between elite compounds situated near ceremonial centers and peripheral residential areas occupied by artisans, laborers, and agricultural families. Elite residences are often larger, constructed with greater care, and located in proximity to ritual plazas and monumental architecture, suggesting both practical oversight of ceremonial activities and social stratification. Artifacts within these spaces, including imported jade, figurines, and exotic shell ornaments, further indicate the concentration of wealth and access to prestige goods among the ruling class. Peripheral areas demonstrate simpler construction and fewer high-status items, reflecting a hierarchical division of labor and access to resources. The spatial distribution of residences illustrates a deliberate urban plan that supported centralized governance, facilitated ritual performance, and reinforced social cohesion through controlled access to both material and symbolic resources. Trade and exchange were fundamental to La Venta's economic and cultural vitality. Archaeologists have identified evidence of long-distance procurement of jade from the Motagua Valley in Guatemala, obsidian from highland Mexico, magnetite from distant regions, and marine shells from the Gulf and Pacific coasts. These materials were transformed into ceremonial objects, ritual offerings, and markers of elite status, reflecting the integration of economic activity with ideological function. The movement of raw materials and finished products across substantial distances demonstrates not only the sophistication of Olmec logistics, but also the networked nature of early Mesoamerican societies. Communities beyond the Olmec heartland adopted Olmec iconography and ceremonial practices, illustrating the spread of cultural influence through prestige exchange rather than conquest. This pattern of interaction laid the groundwork for broader Mesoamerican connectivity, establishing La Venta as a central node in both material and ideological networks. Ritual and ceremonial practice at La Venta played a central role in legitimizing elite authority. Burials, caches, and offerings embedded within the architecture demonstrate that religious and political functions were inseparable. Notable examples include buried mosaics of serpentine blocks arranged in symbolic patterns, offerings of jade figurines, and caches of ceremonial axes, all strategically placed beneath mounds and plazas. These deposits served to reinforce elite control, maintain ritual calendars, and affirm the ruler's position as mediator between human and supernatural realms. The careful alignment of ceremonial spaces, platform orientation, and processional pathways suggests a sophisticated understanding of spatial planning in service of ritual efficacy. By embedding ideological symbolism in physical structures, La Venta's elites consolidated authority and created visible markers of political and spiritual legitimacy. The site's hydraulic infrastructure further underscores the Olmecs' ingenuity and the centralization of authority. Canals, raised causeways, and water management systems facilitated irrigation, drainage, and access to distant resources. Archaeological surveys indicate that these systems required coordinated labor and sustained maintenance, reinforcing the role of elite management in daily operations and long-term urban sustainability. Agricultural surplus generated through these interventions supported specialized artisans, ritual specialists, and administrative personnel. The combination of environmental adaptation, infrastructure, and ritual centrality illustrates the integrated nature of Olmec urban planning at La Venta, where political, economic, and spiritual imperatives were managed collectively to sustain a complex society. The organization of labor at La Venta reveals the emergence of early bureaucratic principles. Coordinating quarrying, transport, construction, and ritual activities required hierarchical management, task specialization, and temporal planning. The magnitude and complexity of these operations suggest that early Olmec rulers exercised authority through both command and ideological legitimation, mobilizing populations with social incentives, ritual obligation, or economic redistribution. This coordination facilitated large-scale architectural projects, the production of elite goods, and the maintenance of ceremonial schedules, creating a framework for centralized governance that would influence subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. By integrating labor, ideology, and resource management, La Venta became a model of early urban civilization in the Americas. In addition to monumental construction, The Olmecs of La Venta developed artistic conventions that conveyed both political authority and cosmological understanding. Colossal heads, altars, thrones, and stelae employed standardized motifs, yet allowed for individualized representation of rulers and ritual sequences. Transformation figures depicting human-animal hybrids, particularly were-jaguars, demonstrate the intersection of social power, spiritual mediation, and cosmological symbolism. These artistic elements were not merely decorative. They functioned as visual language, communicating elite authority, religious ideology, and social cohesion to a diverse population. The replication of motifs across the region indicates the success of this visual communication strategy, contributing to the broader Olmec influence across Mesoamerica. Art and ritual together provided a coherent framework for governance, embedding political legitimacy within the material and symbolic landscape. The decline of San Lorenzo and the concurrent rise of La Venta demonstrate the adaptive and resilient nature of Olmec society. Environmental shifts, resource depletion, and changes in trade networks likely prompted the relocation of political and ceremonial authority. La Venta's emergence illustrates how the Olmecs responded to these challenges by establishing a site with superior agricultural potential, strategic access to resources, and enhanced ritual prominence. The transition also reflects continuity in social organization, artistic expression, and ideological framework, ensuring that Olmec cultural influence persisted despite geographic relocation. The lessons learned from early formative centers informed the development of urban planning, monumental architecture, and ceremonial integration at La Venta, reinforcing the civilization's long-term stability and regional impact. Over the course of several centuries, La Venta became the exemplar of Olmec achievement, combining environmental adaptation, social hierarchy, ceremonial innovation, and regional influence. The integration of monumental architecture, ritual practice, artistic production, and administrative coordination reflects a society capable of sustaining complexity over time. These developments laid the foundation for the diffusion of Olmec cultural elements into neighboring regions, providing a model for governance, artistry, and ritual that influenced subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. By synthesizing economic, political, and ideological elements within a single urban center, La Venta illustrates the mechanisms by which early complex societies maintained cohesion, projected authority, and transmitted cultural innovation. The study of La Venta provides critical insight into the processes that enabled the Olmecs to become a defining civilization in the history of the Americas. The achievements and organizational structures established at La Venta naturally transition into the broader phase of Olmec expansion and influence, which extends beyond the Gulf Coast heartland. The combination of ceremonial centrality, economic integration, and ideological dissemination allowed the Olmecs to exert cultural authority across a wide geographic area. This set the stage for the next chapter, focusing on the development of Olmec regional networks, trade relationships, and the spread of their symbolic and ritual innovations throughout Mesoamerica. The early expansion of Olmec civilization beyond the initial centers of San Lorenzo and La Venta reflects a period of increasing social complexity, regional influence, and cultural innovation. Between approximately 1600 BCE, the Olmecs established a network of secondary settlements and smaller ceremonial sites throughout the Gulf Coast lowlands, creating a cohesive cultural sphere. Archaeological evidence indicates that these communities were linked through trade, shared ritual practice, and common artistic motifs, including distinctive jade figurines, basalt sculptures, and symbolic iconography, such as the word jaguar and transformation imagery. These sites, including Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas, demonstrate that Olmec influence extended over hundreds of kilometers, integrating diverse ecological zones and communities into a broader network of economic and ideological exchange. Settlement patterns suggest that populations were concentrated along rivers and floodplains, providing access to fertile soils, water transportation routes, and strategic locations for controlling regional trade. This period of expansion reflects a deliberate effort by the Olmecs to consolidate political and ceremonial authority while facilitating the diffusion of cultural and religious ideas. The process of regional integration involved both material and symbolic exchange. Artifacts made from imported jade, magnetite, and obsidian appear at multiple secondary sites, demonstrating the movement of raw materials over long distances. These objects were often incorporated into ritual caches, elite residences, or public spaces, signaling both wealth and ideological alignment with the heartland centers. The replication of Olmec artistic styles across the region indicates a shared visual language, which communicated social norms, political legitimacy, and religious concepts. In addition, ceramic production, miniature figurines, and small-scale architectural features reveal localized adaptations of Olmec traditions, showing that communities were able to maintain cultural identity while participating in a broader network. These interactions facilitated the standardization of ceremonial practices, iconographic motifs, and elite symbolism, laying the foundation for a cohesive regional culture. Agriculture and resource management were central to supporting this expansion. Communities utilized a combination of floodplain cultivation, raised fields, and swidden agriculture to sustain growing populations. Archaeobotanical studies indicate continued reliance on maize, beans, squash, and manioc, supplemented by the exploitation of local tree crops, wild fruits, and aquatic resources. The establishment of secondary settlements enabled the Olmecs to extend productive land use across diverse environments, while maintaining access to riverine transport for trade and communication. Water management infrastructure, including canals and raised causeways, facilitated both agricultural productivity and site connectivity. The ability to organize labor for irrigation, field preparation, and construction of ceremonial platforms reflects early bureaucratic mechanisms that coordinated economic and social activity across multiple sites. These practices ensured the stability necessary for population growth, craft specialization, and the elaboration of ritual life throughout the Olmec heartland. Monumental architecture at secondary centers demonstrates the projection of elite authority beyond La Venta and San Lorenzo. At sites such as Tres Zapotes, elevated platforms, mounds, and plazas indicate coordinated labor mobilization and centralized planning. While smaller in scale than the primary centers, these constructions reinforced social hierarchies and provided venues for communal ritual activities, feasting, and ceremonial gatherings. The alignment of structures, processional pathways, and caches of ritual artifacts suggests that the symbolic language of the Olmecs was replicated deliberately to maintain ideological continuity across the region. These architectural features served not only functional purposes, but also communicated the presence and authority of regional elites, establishing political legitimacy and reinforcing social cohesion. By maintaining a recognizable Olmec aesthetic and ceremonial framework, secondary centers strengthened connections between dispersed populations and the primary ceremonial hubs. Trade and interaction networks were critical in sustaining regional cohesion. Obsidian, jade, magnetite, and exotic shells were transported across vast distances, linking Gulf Coast communities with highland regions, the Pacific slope, and interior valleys of Mesoamerica. These materials were often transformed into ritual or prestige goods, reinforcing elite status and ideological authority. The movement of goods also facilitated the transmission of Olmec iconography, ceremonial practices, and architectural models, contributing to a shared cultural identity across the expansion zone. Evidence of these networks appears in the presence of Olmec-style ceramics, figurines, and basalt carvings at sites far removed from the core centers. The consistency of these artifacts indicates a degree of standardization, suggesting that elites played a central role in regulating trade, ceremonial exchange, and cultural dissemination. By integrating economic, artistic, and ritual networks, the Olmecs were able to extend their influence across diverse communities without relying on direct military conquest. Craft specialization intensified during this period of expansion. Archaeological excavations at secondary sites reveal workshops for ceramic production, stone carving, and the manufacture of ritual objects. Standardization in size, form and iconography suggests that artisans worked under the supervision of elites or within household workshops serving the needs of ceremonial centers. Specialized labor enabled the production of objects required for both local ritual practice and long-distance exchange. This specialization reflects an increasingly stratified society, where elites controlled production, distribution, and ceremonial use of material culture. By centralizing oversight of specialized crafts, the Olmecs reinforced social hierarchies and maintained cohesion across dispersed settlements. The combination of skilled craftsmanship, ideological symbolism, and elite regulation illustrates the sophisticated integration of economic and ritual systems across the expanding Olmec sphere. Ritual and ceremonial practice remained central to the consolidation of regional authority. Secondary sites often contain caches of jade figurines, axes, and other symbolic objects, placed within mounds, plazas, or residential compounds. These deposits indicate that ritual activity was not confined to primary centers, but permeated the broader cultural landscape. Public ceremonies, feasts, and processions served multiple functions, legitimizing elite authority, reinforcing social hierarchy, regulating agricultural cycles, and transmitting cosmological knowledge. The replication of ceremonial architecture and offerings across multiple sites demonstrates that ritual practice functioned as a unifying mechanism, linking dispersed populations and maintaining ideological continuity. By embedding authority within ritual performance, the Olmecs were able to extend influence across regions while sustaining social cohesion. Population movement and settlement patterns during this period suggest both strategic planning and adaptive response to environmental conditions. Archaeological surveys indicate that secondary settlements were often located along rivers or on elevated terraces, facilitating agriculture, resource access, and defense. Some communities appear to have emerged in response to population pressures, soil depletion, or the decline of older centers, reflecting a dynamic system of settlement reorganization. The placement of ceremonial platforms, processional spaces, and elite residences within these communities indicates that social hierarchy and ritual centrality were maintained even in newly established sites. This pattern demonstrates the Olmecs' capacity to project political and ideological influence across diverse ecological zones while accommodating demographic and environmental challenges. Over time, the expansion of Olmec cultural influence contributed to the standardization of visual and ideological elements across Mesoamerica. Artistic motifs, such as the word jaguar, transformation figures, and symbolic axes, appear consistently across both primary and secondary centers. Architectural forms, including elevated mounds, ceremonial plazas, and processional alignments, were replicated in smaller sites, reinforcing the cultural coherence of the Olmec sphere. These practices not only strengthened regional identity, but also established templates for successor civilizations, including the Zapotecs, Maya, and other early Mesoamerican societies. By maintaining continuity in ritual, art, and governance, the Olmecs ensured that their cultural innovations would be recognized, adopted, and adapted long after the decline of their primary centers. The regional expansion phase also reflects the dynamic relationship between environmental adaptation and social organization. By strategically locating settlements, managing agricultural resources, and coordinating labor for monumental construction, the Olmecs demonstrated an ability to integrate ecological understanding with social and ideological systems. Long-distance trade facilitated the movement of both material and symbolic goods, reinforcing elite authority and enabling the dissemination of Olmec cultural practices across broad areas. Craft specialization and ritual centrality provided mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion, while the replication of iconography and architectural forms ensured ideological continuity. Together, these elements illustrate a sophisticated approach to civilization building that integrated economy, religion, and governance across a regional network. The developments of this period set the stage for the emergence of a more formalized Olmec political hierarchy and the consolidation of ideological authority at ceremonial centers. The network of secondary sites demonstrates that the Olmecs were capable of projecting influence across diverse communities, standardizing cultural norms, and managing complex economic and ritual systems. This expansion phase provided the necessary social, economic, and symbolic infrastructure for subsequent growth, including intensified trade networks, monumental construction at primary centers, and the elaboration of elite ideology. By establishing a cohesive regional identity, the Olmecs laid the foundations for long-term cultural and political influence throughout Mesoamerica, ensuring that the innovations of the Gulf Coast heartland would resonate far beyond their immediate environment. The insights gained from this phase of expansion naturally lead to the next stage of Olmec development, which focuses on the consolidation of authority, the refinement of ritual practice, and the formation of enduring political structures that define the civilization at its peak. Understanding how the Olmecs extended their influence regionally provides essential context for analyzing the emergence of complex social hierarchies, interregional interaction, and the enduring ideological legacy of Mesoamerica. The consolidation of Olmec authority across the Gulf Coast lowlands marks a significant stage in the development of their political and ritual systems. Between approximately 900 and 600 BCE, archaeological evidence indicates that primary centers such as La Venta, in conjunction with secondary sites, began to exhibit more formalized social hierarchies and centralized administrative practices. Settlement patterns reveal a clear differentiation between elite ceremonial precincts and peripheral residential zones, reflecting the emergence of stratified governance. Elevated mounds, structured plazas, and processional avenues served both functional and ideological purposes, providing platforms for communal gatherings, ritual activity, and elite visibility. These spatial arrangements illustrate the deliberate integration of social, political, and religious functions within urban planning. Radiocarbon dating of construction layers and associated offerings demonstrates sustained investment in monumental architecture, indicating continuity of elite authority and the maintenance of complex labor networks. The ability to mobilize and coordinate large-scale projects reflects administrative sophistication, suggesting the presence of hierarchical structures capable of regulating resource allocation, labor organization, and ritual scheduling. Ceremonial practice played a pivotal role in reinforcing centralized authority during this period. Excavations at La Venta and Tres Zapotes reveal caches of jade figurines, polished stone axes, and other symbolic offerings strategically placed beneath platforms, plazas, and elite residences. These deposits indicate that ritual activities were carefully orchestrated to legitimize political power, maintain social cohesion, and regulate the timing of agricultural and calendrical cycles. The replication of ceremonial architecture and symbolic motifs across both primary and secondary centers demonstrates the deliberate projection of ideological authority over a wide geographic area. Transformation imagery, particularly the were-jaguar motif, continued to function as a visual language linking elite rulers to supernatural forces. By embedding political legitimacy within ritual and artistic expression, the Olmecs established a system in which governance, religion, and social hierarchy were inseparable, creating a cohesive and enduring model for complex society. Economic management was central to sustaining this consolidation of authority. Agricultural surplus generated along fertile river floodplains supported population growth, craft specialization, and monumental construction. Archaeobotanical evidence confirms the continued cultivation of maize, beans, squash, and manioc, supplemented by riverine resources, wild fruits, and protein sources such as fish and small mammals. The organization of labor for agricultural production, combined with the management of storage, distribution, and surplus allocation, suggests the existence of administrative oversight at both local and regional levels. This management likely involved elite control over both material resources and ritual distribution, with offerings of surplus goods reinforcing social hierarchies and ideological authority. In addition, evidence of long-distance trade, including jade from Guatemala, obsidian from the highlands, and marine shells from coastal zones, indicates that economic networks were instrumental in projecting Olmec influence, and sustaining elite privilege. Craft specialization intensified during this period, reflecting the integration of economic, social, and ideological systems. Workshops associated with both primary and secondary centers produced ceramics, polished stone tools, figurines, and ritual objects in standardized forms. These production centers were likely supervised by elites or organized within household networks, enabling control over both the manufacture and ceremonial use of material culture. Specialized production served multiple purposes, supporting ritual practice, signaling elite status, and reinforcing regional identity through standardized iconography. Artifacts found across distant settlements demonstrate that Olmec artisans maintained consistent stylistic conventions while accommodating local variations, contributing to the cohesion of the broader cultural sphere. This combination of technical skill, artistic expression, and elite oversight highlights the sophisticated organization of labor and resources necessary to sustain the Olmec polity during its peak period. The elaboration of monumental architecture further reflects the consolidation of authority and ritual centrality. Mounds, plazas, and processional avenues were constructed with careful attention to alignment, scale, and function, reinforcing both political hierarchy and ceremonial practice. Elevated platforms served as stages for elite visibility, while structured plazas accommodated public gatherings and ritual observances. Caches of ceremonial objects, often buried beneath or adjacent to monumental structures, indicate deliberate integration of material offerings into urban design. These architectural and ritual strategies reinforced elite control, communicated ideological legitimacy to the broader population, and established La Venta and other centers as regional hubs of political and spiritual authority. The careful replication of architectural forms and ceremonial practices across multiple sites demonstrates the deliberate standardization of governance and ritual, strengthening both social cohesion and interregional influence. Trade and interaction networks were essential in supporting the Olmecs' consolidated authority. Archaeological analysis reveals extensive movement of materials such as jade, magnetite, obsidian, and marine shells, linking the Gulf Coast lowlands with highland Mexico, the Motagua Valley, and the Pacific Coast. These materials were transformed into ritual objects, symbolic artifacts, and elite prestige goods, reinforcing social hierarchies and ideological authority. The circulation of Olmec-style artifacts across secondary and tertiary sites illustrates the effectiveness of cultural dissemination as a mechanism of influence. Communities participating in these networks adopted Olmec iconography, ceremonial models, and elite practices, creating a cohesive regional cultural identity. By integrating material, symbolic, and ritual exchange, the Olmecs extended their authority across diverse populations without the need for military conquest, demonstrating a sophisticated approach to soft power and cultural cohesion. The consolidation of Olmec authority also involved demographic and settlement strategies. Archaeological surveys indicate that elites strategically established new communities along rivers, terraces, and resource-rich areas, balancing agricultural productivity, access to trade routes, and ritual centrality. Population concentrations in proximity to ceremonial centers enabled efficient mobilization of labor for construction, agriculture, and ritual activity, while peripheral settlements accommodated specialized artisans, farmers, and laborers. This settlement hierarchy reinforced social stratification and allowed elites to monitor and regulate economic and ritual activity. Patterns of relocation, expansion, and integration reflect adaptive responses to environmental and social pressures, demonstrating that Olmec governance was both dynamic and resilient. The deliberate organization of settlements underscores the link between political authority, resource management, and ritual centrality in maintaining societal cohesion. Symbolic communication and ideological reinforcement were fundamental to the consolidation process. Artistic motifs, including the war-jaguar, axes, transformation figures, and other iconography, were consistently reproduced across sites to signify elite authority, ritual legitimacy, and cosmological order. Monumental sculpture, stele, and ceremonial architecture served as both visual markers and functional spaces for enacting and observing ritualized authority. By codifying symbolic language and integrating it into both public and private spheres, the Olmecs established a coherent ideological framework that linked governance, ritual, and social hierarchy. The standardization of iconography across regions ensured continuity in the interpretation of political and religious authority, enabling dispersed communities to recognize and participate in a shared cultural system. By combining centralized governance, ritual integration, economic management, and symbolic standardization, the Olmecs achieved a level of societal cohesion that facilitated the long-term stability and influence of their civilization. The consolidation of authority at La Venta and other centers allowed elites to maintain control over labor, resources, and ideological messaging, providing the structural foundation for both internal stability and external cultural projection. These processes created the necessary infrastructure for subsequent periods of Olmec innovation, including the refinement of monumental sculpture, expansion of trade networks, and elaboration of ritual practice. The integration of these elements highlights the sophistication of Olmec society and its capacity to sustain complex social systems across diverse ecological and geographic contexts. The centralization of authority and the development of standardized ritual and artistic practices naturally set the stage for the next phase of Olmec history, the peak period of cultural and ceremonial achievement. During this stage, primary centers reached their architectural, artistic, and ideological zenith, while the influence of Olmec society expanded across Mesoamerica. Understanding the mechanisms of consolidation is essential for interpreting the broader patterns of Olmec civilization, including the emergence of enduring political structures, regional networks of exchange, and the dissemination of ideological and artistic traditions that would shape subsequent Mesoamerican cultures. The peak of Olmec civilization, spanning approximately 600 to 400 BCE, represents a period of remarkable cultural, political, and artistic achievement, during which the civilization reached the height of its regional influence. During this period, the primary centers of La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and Laguna de los Cerros exhibited unprecedented urban planning, monumental architecture, and ideological consolidation. Archaeological evidence indicates that these sites were carefully organized, with ceremonial precincts, elevated platforms, and residential zones reflecting a sophisticated understanding of social hierarchy, spatial organization, and ritual function. The population density within these centers increased significantly, supported by intensified agriculture, expanded trade networks, and the systematic mobilization of labor. These developments suggest that the Olmecs had established a stable and centralized system of governance capable of sustaining large populations, coordinating complex construction projects, and enforcing social norms across a dispersed network of communities. Monumental architecture reached its apex during this period, with the construction of enormous earthen mounds, ceremonial plazas, and basalt sculptures that served as both functional and symbolic elements within Olmec society. La Venta's Great Pyramid, for example, was expanded and enhanced with successive layers of fill and stone, creating a visual and ritual focal point for the surrounding population. Elevated platforms and plazas accommodated public ceremonies, processions, and gatherings that reinforced the authority of the ruling elite. At Tres Zapotes, similar architectural features were constructed on a slightly smaller scale, yet maintain the same ideological purpose of linking leadership with ritual performance. The scale, precision, and uniformity of these constructions indicate a high degree of social coordination, managerial skill, and technical knowledge. Quarrying, transporting, and assembling basalt blocks, some weighing several tons, required meticulous planning, labor organization, and logistical oversight, demonstrating the administrative sophistication of Olmec governance at its peak. Artistic and symbolic production also flourished during this period, providing insight into both the aesthetic sensibilities and the ideological frameworks of Olmec society. Colossal heads, often carved from single blocks of basalt, reached their largest and most refined forms, displaying individualized features, elaborate headgear, and precise detailing that likely represented rulers or elite figures. Alongside these monumental sculptures, stelae, thrones, and altars were carved with intricate reliefs depicting supernatural beings, ritual events, and transformation motifs, including the iconic were-jaguar imagery. Smaller-scale objects, such as jade figurines, polished stone axes, and ceremonial implements, continued to be produced in workshops linked to elite residences or household units. The combination of monumental and portable art demonstrates the integration of aesthetic, political, and religious expression, providing a visual language through which the Olmecs articulated social hierarchy, ideological authority, and cosmological understanding. Trade and interregional exchange were essential to sustaining the peak Olmec civilization. Archaeological analysis of materials from this period reveals extensive networks connecting the Gulf Coast lowlands with highland regions, the Motagua Valley in Guatemala, and the Pacific coastal zones. Jade, magnetite, obsidian, and exotic shells were transported over long distances, often transformed into ritual objects, ceremonial implements, or markers of elite status. These networks facilitated not only the movement of material goods, but also the dissemination of Olmec artistic styles, ceremonial models, and ideological concepts. Evidence from secondary and tertiary sites demonstrates the adoption of Olmec motifs, architectural forms, and ritual practices across a wide geographic area, illustrating the civilization's influence over both proximate and distant communities. This expansion of cultural and economic influence highlights the sophistication of Olmec society in projecting authority through both tangible and symbolic means. Agricultural intensification played a central role in sustaining the population and supporting monumental construction projects during this period. Archaeobotanical evidence indicates continued reliance on maize, beans, squash, and manioc, supplemented by riverine resources, wild fruits, and terrestrial fauna. Raised fields, canals, and terracing systems facilitated the management of water, soil fertility, and crop productivity, ensuring stable yields for both subsistence and surplus. The surplus enabled the support of specialized artisans, ritual specialists, and administrative personnel, creating a complex division of labor. Evidence of coordinated labor mobilization for construction projects, agricultural infrastructure, and ritual activity demonstrates the organizational capacity of Olmec elites. By linking agricultural production with ceremonial and administrative functions, the Olmecs created an integrated socio-economic system capable of sustaining urban centers and regional influence. Residential patterns during the peak period reflect an increasing degree of social stratification. Elite compounds were strategically located near ceremonial precincts, providing direct access to ritual spaces and reinforcing political visibility. These compounds often contained elaborate offerings, imported materials, and evidence of specialized craft production, underscoring the concentration of wealth and authority within the ruling class. Peripheral residential zones housed farmers, artisans, and laborers, maintaining the economic and functional base of the centers while remaining subordinate to elite oversight. This spatial organization illustrates the deliberate structuring of urban centers to reinforce hierarchy, facilitate resource management, and ensure participation in ritualized social systems. The consistency of this pattern across multiple sites indicates the replication of successful governance models, contributing to the cohesion of the Olmec cultural sphere. Ritual practice during this period was closely integrated with governance and social organization. Public ceremonies, processions, and feasting were conducted within plazas, atop platforms, or adjacent to monumental sculptures, reinforcing the ideological authority of elites and codifying social hierarchies. Burial practices and ceremonial caches embedded within architectural features demonstrate the intertwining of religious belief, political legitimacy, and material culture. Transformation imagery, including depictions of were-jaguars and human-animal hybrids, symbolized both cosmological concepts and elite mediation between the human and supernatural realms. The careful replication of ritual forms and artistic motifs across sites suggests standardized ceremonial protocols, which facilitated cultural cohesion and ensured the recognition of elite authority across the regional network. By integrating ritual, art, and governance, the Olmecs created a durable ideological framework that underpinned their peak period society. Technological and craft innovations also reached a high point during this stage. Basalt carving, jade working, and ceramic production were refined to unprecedented levels of precision and complexity. Colossal heads required intricate quarrying, transport, and carving techniques, illustrating advanced knowledge of stonework, logistics, and collective labor organization. Jade and other precious materials were fashioned into symbolic objects, personal adornment, and ritual implements, demonstrating both technical skill and understanding of material properties. Standardization of forms, motifs, and production techniques across multiple sites indicates coordination between workshops and elite authorities, ensuring both functional use and ideological coherence. These innovations reflect the integration of artistry, administration, and ritual within the organizational structure of Olmec society, reinforcing both social hierarchy and cultural continuity. The peak period also saw increasing interaction with distant regions, contributing to the spread of Olmec influence throughout Mesoamerica. Artifacts bearing Olmec motifs appear in the Valley of Mexico, Oaxaca, and the Maya lowlands, often incorporated into local contexts and adapted to regional styles. This diffusion of artistic, architectural, and ritual elements illustrates the effectiveness of Olmec cultural networks in transmitting ideology and consolidating influence without the use of direct conquest. By projecting authority through symbolic means, trade, and ceremonial standardization, the Olmecs established a cultural legacy that shaped the development of subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. These interactions reveal the strategic use of culture and ideology as instruments of regional integration and societal cohesion. Environmental management remained a critical component of peak-period Olmec society. Strategic settlement locations, water management systems, and agricultural innovation facilitated both population growth and urban stability. Canals, raised fields, and artificial terraces allowed communities to mitigate flooding, manage irrigation, and increase food production. The coordination required to construct and maintain these systems demonstrates the central role of elite oversight in organizing labor and resources. By effectively managing both natural and social environments, the Olmecs ensured the sustainability of their urban centers and maintained the conditions necessary for continued monumental construction, ritual activity, and regional influence. This integration of environmental adaptation with social and political systems exemplifies the sophistication of Olmec civilization during its peak. The achievements of the Olmecs during this period set the stage for subsequent phases of cultural refinement, regional influence, and eventual transformation. The consolidation of monumental architecture, centralized authority, ritual standardization, and artistic excellence provided a model for successor civilizations, establishing templates for urban planning, governance, and ideological integration throughout Mesoamerica. By combining technical skill, social organization, and symbolic communication, the Olmecs created a durable system capable of sustaining complex society, projecting influence across diverse regions, and leaving an enduring legacy for centuries to follow. Understanding the peak period of Olmec civilization is essential for interpreting both the evolution of Mesoamerican cultural traditions and the mechanisms by which early complex societies maintained cohesion, authority, and cultural continuity. The culmination of these achievements naturally leads to the next phase of Olmec history, the refinement and codification of political and ceremonial structures, the emergence of enduring artistic and ritual conventions, and the preparation for both regional influence and eventual challenges. The processes established during this peak period formed the foundation upon which Olmec society would enter its later stages, consolidating its legacy and shaping the trajectory of Mesoamerican civilization for generations. The refinement of Olmec political structures during the civilization's peak period represents a critical development in the consolidation of authority, social hierarchy, and ceremonial integration. Between approximately 600 and 400 BCE, evidence from La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and other major centers demonstrates that elites had established increasingly formalized governance systems capable of coordinating labor, managing resources, and regulating ritual activity across both primary and secondary sites. Settlement patterns reveal a pronounced spatial hierarchy, with elevated ceremonial precincts and elite compounds positioned centrally, surrounded by residential zones for artisans, laborers, and agricultural producers. These spatial arrangements reflect deliberate urban planning designed to reinforce social stratification, facilitate labor mobilization, and ensure elite oversight of both economic and ritual life. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis indicate that monumental construction and associated ceremonial deposits were maintained over extended periods, demonstrating the stability of centralized authority and the capacity for long-term governance. Archaeological investigations reveal that elite authority was closely tied to ritual practice. Large-scale offerings, caches of jade figurines, polished stone axes, and ceremonial objects were systematically interred beneath platforms, plazas, and thrones, underscoring the integration of political and religious authority. The consistency of ritual placement and the replication of offerings across multiple sites suggest the existence of codified ceremonial protocols, standardized through elite oversight. Public gatherings, processions, and feasts functioned as both social and political instruments, enabling rulers to assert control, maintain cohesion, and communicate ideological legitimacy to the broader population. The repetition of symbolic motifs, such as the word jaguar, transformation figures, and ritual implements, reinforced elite authority and provided a shared visual and ritual language that transcended individual communities. Economic organization during this period further strengthened centralized governance. The Olmecs relied on a combination of intensive agriculture, resource management, and trade networks to sustain both urban populations and monumental construction projects. Archaeobotanical evidence confirms continued cultivation of maize, beans, squash, and manioc, supplemented by riverine fish, wild fruits, and terrestrial game. Storage facilities, raised fields, and water management systems indicate that agricultural surplus was effectively regulated and redistributed to support specialized artisans, ritual specialists, and laborers. The coordination of labor for construction, farming, and ceremonial activity implies a hierarchical administrative structure, with elites controlling access to resources and directing communal efforts in alignment with political and ritual objectives. This integration of economic, social, and ceremonial systems enabled the Olmecs to maintain stable urban centers and sustain regional influence. Craft specialization intensified under the oversight of centralized authority. Workshops dedicated to ceramics, stone carving, jade working, and ritual object production demonstrate high levels of skill and standardization. Basalt monuments, including colossal heads and altars, required coordinated quarrying, transport, and carving, reflecting sophisticated technical knowledge and the ability to organize large labor forces. Artisans produced both monumental and portable objects, ensuring consistency in iconography and symbolic meaning across the Olmec cultural sphere. Standardized forms and motifs reinforced elite ideology, allowing communities throughout the region to recognize and participate in a shared ritual and political framework. The integration of craft specialization, ritual practice, and governance illustrates the complex interdependence of social, economic, and ideological systems during this period. Architectural refinement continued to play a central role in consolidating authority. Elevated platforms, ceremonial plazas, processional avenues, and mounds were constructed with precise alignment, scale, and orientation to serve both functional and symbolic purposes. Platforms provided stages for elite visibility and ritual enactment, while plazas accommodated large gatherings and public ceremonies. The placement of ritual caches beneath or adjacent to monumental architecture illustrates the deliberate embedding of political and spiritual authority within the built environment. Architectural uniformity across primary and secondary centers reinforced regional cohesion and provided a consistent spatial framework through which elites exercised control, communicated ideological principles, and maintained social order. The replication of architectural forms ensured that dispersed communities recognized the legitimacy of Olmec rulers and participated in a shared ceremonial tradition. Trade and long-distance interaction networks were integral to sustaining political authority and ceremonial centrality. Olmec elites regulated the flow of jade from Guatemala, obsidian from the highlands, magnetite from distant regions, and marine shells from coastal zones. These materials were transformed into ritual objects, prestige goods, and symbolic implements, reinforcing social hierarchies and ideological authority. Evidence of Olmec-style artifacts appearing at secondary and tertiary sites indicates the effectiveness of cultural dissemination as a mechanism of influence. Communities engaged with Olmec trade networks adopted iconography, ceremonial conventions, and architectural models, contributing to the cohesion of the Olmec cultural sphere. By integrating material exchange with ideological messaging, the Olmecs projected authority over a wide geographic region without reliance on military conquest, highlighting the sophistication of their governance and cultural diplomacy. Residential organization during this period further demonstrates the consolidation of social hierarchy. Elite compounds were strategically located near ceremonial precincts, providing oversight of ritual activity and facilitating visibility within the urban environment. These compounds contained evidence of imported goods, specialized workshops, and ritual deposits, reflecting the concentration of wealth and authority among ruling families. Peripheral residential areas housed artisans, laborers, and agricultural producers, maintaining the functional base of the centers while remaining subordinate to elite control. This spatial differentiation reinforced social stratification and ensured that elites maintained direct access to economic, ritual, and labor resources. Consistent patterns across multiple sites suggest the replication of successful governance and settlement strategies, contributing to the stability and cohesion of the Olmec network. Symbolic communication and ritual codification were essential components of centralized authority. The repetition of transformation imagery, war-jaguar motifs, ritual implements, and ceremonial iconography provided a standardized visual language across Olmec communities. Monumental sculptures, altars, and stelae served as focal points for both ritual and political expression, linking elites with supernatural authority. By codifying symbolic language and integrating it with architectural and urban planning, the Olmecs established a durable ideological framework that reinforced social hierarchies and facilitated the recognition of elite legitimacy across the region. Standardization of ritual and iconography allowed dispersed communities to participate in a cohesive cultural system, strengthening political control and social cohesion. Environmental adaptation was closely tied to governance and ritual centrality. Strategic site selection, water management infrastructure, and agricultural innovation enabled the Olmecs to maintain urban stability, sustain population growth, and support monumental projects. Canals, raised fields, and artificial terraces facilitated irrigation, mitigated flooding, and increased food production. The construction and maintenance of these systems required coordinated labor and administrative oversight, reflecting the central role of elites in managing both natural and social resources. By effectively integrating environmental management with political and ceremonial objectives, the Olmecs ensured the long-term viability of their centers and the continuity of social and ritual structures. This integration exemplifies the sophistication of Olmec governance during the civilization's peak period. The refinement of political and ceremonial structures during this period laid the groundwork for enduring Olmec influence. By codifying ritual practices, standardizing iconography, and consolidating centralized authority, the Olmecs established templates for urban planning, governance, and ideological integration that would influence subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. The systems developed during this phase enabled the coordination of labor, management of resources, and dissemination of cultural norms across a broad region, ensuring both the stability and resilience of Olmec society. Understanding the consolidation of authority and refinement of ritual practice provides critical insight into how early complex societies maintained cohesion, projected influence, and prepared for both regional expansion and long-term legacy. These developments naturally transition to the next phase of Olmec history, the interplay between cultural consolidation, artistic innovation, and regional interaction. The refinement of political and ceremonial authority set the stage for the civilization's enduring artistic achievements, its role in shaping broader Mesoamerican networks, and the gradual emergence of challenges that would ultimately influence the trajectory of Olmec society. The development of Olmec trade networks during the civilization's height represents a defining factor in the expansion of influence and the integration of Mesoamerican societies. Between approximately 600 and 400 BCE, the Olmecs established extensive economic and cultural linkages that connected the Gulf Coast lowlands with distant highland regions, the Pacific slope, and interior valleys. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the movement of materials such as jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from the highlands of central Mexico, magnetite, serpentine, and marine shells across considerable distances. These materials were frequently transformed into ceremonial objects, elite regalia, and ritual implements, reinforcing both social hierarchy and ideological authority. The consistent appearance of Olmec-style artifacts at secondary and tertiary sites indicates a deliberate and sustained effort to project cultural influence and maintain standardized symbolic and aesthetic conventions across a broad geographic area. The mechanisms of Olmec trade involved both riverine and overland routes, reflecting strategic adaptation to the Gulf Coast's complex ecology. Settlements were often located along navigable rivers, facilitating the transport of heavy basalt blocks, jade, and other commodities to ceremonial centers. Canoes and rafts likely carried goods along interconnected waterways, while overland routes linked inland valleys to coastal hubs. Archaeological surveys of trade-related infrastructure, such as causeways, raised pathways, and quarries, reveal the logistical sophistication required to maintain these networks. By organizing transportation, labor, and distribution over extensive distances, the Olmecs demonstrated advanced administrative capabilities. This logistical coordination enabled the circulation of both essential resources and symbolic materials, integrating economic activity with ritual and political objectives. The exchange of materials was inseparable from the dissemination of Olmec ideology. Artistic motifs, ceremonial implements, and ritual objects traveled alongside jade, basalt, and obsidian, ensuring that participating communities adopted both the aesthetic and symbolic conventions of the Olmec heartland. Colossal heads, stelae, thrones, and finely carved figurines served as markers of authority and ritual knowledge, establishing cultural norms across dispersed regions. Communities receiving these materials participated in shared ceremonial practices and adopted standardized iconography, reinforcing cohesion and recognition of elite authority. This integration of material, ideological, and artistic exchange exemplifies the Olmec's ability to extend influence without relying on military conquest, relying instead on cultural diplomacy, ceremonial reciprocity, and economic integration. Secondary centers played a critical role in facilitating Olmec trade and cultural dissemination. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas functioned as hubs for both production and exchange, linking peripheral communities to the core centers of La Venta and San Lorenzo. These settlements housed workshops for ceramics, jade working, basalt carving, and the production of ritual objects. Standardization in production, form, and iconography ensured that goods circulating through these networks communicated consistent symbolic and ritual messages. Archaeological evidence of elite residences, ritual caches, and public architecture at secondary sites indicates that they were not passive recipients of Olmec influence, but active participants in the regional system, contributing labor, materials, and ceremonial practices to reinforce centralized authority. This network structure allowed the Olmecs to maintain cohesion across a vast and ecologically diverse territory. Agricultural surplus was integral to sustaining trade networks and facilitating long-distance exchange. Archaeobotanical studies indicate that communities along the Gulf Coast lowlands cultivated maize, beans, squash, and manioc, supplemented by fish, wild fruits, and terrestrial fauna. Surplus production supported specialized artisans, administrators, and laborers, enabling the mobilization of resources for monumental construction and ceremonial activity. The coordination of food distribution reinforced social hierarchy, ensuring that elites retained control over both material and symbolic resources. This integration of agricultural management with trade and ritual systems highlights the complexity of Olmec governance, demonstrating the interplay between economic production, social organization, and ideological reinforcement. Ceremonial practice and trade were deeply interconnected. Caches of jade figurines, polished stone axes, and symbolic objects were often transported along trade routes for deposition in ceremonial precincts or public plazas. These objects not only signified elite authority, but also facilitated the standardization of ritual practices across multiple sites. Processional avenues, platforms, and plazas served as venues for public rituals, feasts, and gatherings, linking economic exchange to ideological expression. The replication of architectural and ritual forms at secondary and tertiary sites ensured consistency in ceremonial practice, reinforcing the recognition of elite authority and maintaining the cohesion of the Olmec cultural sphere. By combining economic integration with ritual standardization, the Olmecs created a system in which trade served both material and symbolic functions. Artistic production played a central role in Olmec trade networks. Colossal heads, altars, stelae, and finely carved figurines functioned as both ceremonial objects and instruments of cultural dissemination. The transport of these items over long distances required careful planning, coordination, and technical expertise, reflecting the administrative capabilities of elite authorities. Smaller-scale objects, such as jade pendants, polished axes, and ceramic figurines, circulated widely, providing accessible markers of Olmec identity and ritual practice. The standardization of artistic conventions ensured that recipients of these materials recognized their symbolic significance and participated in the broader ideological framework. This integration of art, trade, and ritual demonstrates the sophistication of Olmec cultural strategy, linking material production with social and political influence. Environmental adaptation was crucial to maintaining extensive trade networks. Rivers, floodplains, and coastal routes provided natural transportation corridors, while elevated terraces and causeways facilitated overland movement. Agricultural and craft production supported population centers that functioned as nodes within this network, enabling the storage, processing, and redistribution of resources. Settlement placement reflects careful consideration of both logistical efficiency and ecological sustainability. By coordinating environmental management with trade and ritual objectives, the Olmecs ensured the continuity of economic, political, and cultural systems across their territory. This integration illustrates the holistic approach of Olmec society, where environmental, social, and ideological factors were interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Population movement and demographic organization supported trade and cultural integration. Secondary sites often emerged in strategically advantageous locations, facilitating interaction between hinterland communities and primary ceremonial centers. These settlements enabled the redistribution of goods, the coordination of labor, and the participation of diverse populations in shared ritual and economic systems. Archaeological evidence of habitation structures, workshops, and ceremonial deposits demonstrates that these communities were actively involved in the production, transport, and ritual use of goods. This networked settlement pattern contributed to the resilience and adaptability of Olmec society, allowing it to maintain influence across a wide geographic area while accommodating demographic and environmental variability. The achievements of Olmec trade networks had enduring implications for Mesoamerican civilization. By integrating economic, ritual, and symbolic systems, the Olmecs created a model for regional cohesion, cultural standardization, and long-distance influence. Subsequent civilizations, including the Zapotecs, Maya, and other early Mesoamerican societies, adopted similar strategies of centralized authority, ceremonial standardization, and interregional exchange. The Olmecs' ability to coordinate production, transport, and ideological dissemination across diverse ecological zones demonstrates their advanced understanding of complex societal organization. These networks not only sustained the peak of Olmec civilization, but also provided templates for cultural and economic interaction that would persist throughout Mesoamerican history. Understanding the development and operation of Olmec trade networks provides essential context for analyzing both the civilization's internal cohesion and its influence on surrounding regions. The integration of material exchange, artistic dissemination, and ritual practice allowed the Olmecs to project authority, maintain social hierarchy, and standardize cultural norms across a broad territory. These achievements highlight the sophistication of Olmec political, economic, and ideological systems, and illustrate how early civilizations leveraged trade as both a practical and symbolic instrument of governance. The success of these networks set the stage for the subsequent refinement of political and ceremonial structures, as well as the continuation of Olmec cultural influence throughout Mesoamerica. The strategic integration of trade, craft production, and ritual practice naturally transitions to the next stage of Olmec development, the formalization of governance, codification of elite authority, and elaboration of ceremonial life that characterize the later stages of their peak period. The effectiveness of these networks provides a foundation for understanding how the Olmecs maintained cohesion, standardized cultural expression, and projected influence across a region of considerable geographic and ecological diversity. The consolidation of Olmec ceremonial centers during the civilization's height reflects both the sophistication of their urban planning and the centrality of ritual in political governance. Between approximately 600 and 400 BCE, primary sites such as La Venta and Tres Zapotes underwent substantial architectural and spatial refinement, demonstrating the deliberate organization of ceremonial precincts to reinforce elite authority and social cohesion. Elevated platforms, plazas, mounds, and processional avenues were constructed with precise alignment and scale, reflecting both functional needs and ideological considerations. The arrangement of residential, ritual, and administrative spaces illustrates a hierarchical spatial order designed to delineate elite authority, facilitate labor coordination, and provide clear visual access to ceremonial activities. Stratigraphic and radiocarbon evidence indicates sustained maintenance and expansion of these centers, underscoring their enduring role in the organization and legitimation of Olmec society. Ceremonial architecture functioned as a tangible expression of both political and cosmological order. The Great Pyramid of La Venta, for example, was systematically enlarged and refined with successive layers of fill, creating a dominant visual landmark that reinforced elite presence and control. Adjacent plazas and elevated platforms served as stages for public rituals, processions, and communal gatherings, while thrones, altars, and monumental sculptures provided focal points for both ritual observance and the display of authority. Architectural alignments often corresponded with astronomical observations, indicating an integration of cosmological knowledge into urban design. These constructions were not purely functional. They communicated social hierarchy, ritual significance, and ideological continuity, ensuring that the symbolic and practical dimensions of governance were closely intertwined. Ritual practices embedded within ceremonial centers reinforced elite authority and codified social norms. Archaeological evidence from caches, burials, and offering pits indicates that ritual activity involved the strategic deposition of jade figurines, polished stone axes, ceramics, and other symbolic objects. These deposits were carefully organized, reflecting standardized ceremonial protocols under elite supervision. Public rituals, including feasts, processions, and offerings, served multiple functions, legitimizing political power, reinforcing social cohesion, regulating agricultural cycles, and transmitting cosmological knowledge. Transformation imagery, particularly were-jaguar motifs and human-animal hybrids, signified the mediation of elites between the human and supernatural realms. The replication of these ritual forms across multiple centers ensured a shared ceremonial vocabulary that linked dispersed populations to centralized authority and reinforced Olmec ideological unity. Economic and labor organization were essential to the construction and maintenance of ceremonial centers. Monumental architecture required the mobilization of large workforces, including artisans, laborers, and specialists, coordinated by elite administrators. Quarrying and transporting basalt blocks, some weighing several tons, demanded careful planning, logistical oversight, and sustained effort over extended periods. Agricultural surplus supported these endeavors, providing food for laborers and facilitating the specialization of craft production. Workshops associated with ceremonial precincts produced ritual objects, ceramics, and finely carved jade artifacts, which were distributed throughout the regional network to reinforce ideological and social cohesion. The integration of economic management with ceremonial construction demonstrates the sophistication of Olmec governance, linking material resources, labor organization, and ritual practice in a cohesive societal system. Secondary and tertiary sites were closely connected to primary ceremonial centers through both trade and ritual networks. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas functioned as local hubs for production, ceremonial activity, and redistribution of goods. Artifacts from these centers demonstrate both adherence to Olmec stylistic conventions and localized adaptation, indicating that communities participated actively in the broader ideological and economic system. The replication of monumental architecture, iconography, and ceremonial practices at secondary sites facilitated recognition of elite authority, standardized ritual observance, and reinforced cohesion across the cultural sphere. These interconnections illustrate that Olmec ceremonial centers were not isolated. They formed a networked system in which material, symbolic, and ritual exchange ensured social integration and regional influence. The role of art within ceremonial centers further illustrates the integration of ideology, politics, and ritual. Colossal heads, stelae, altars, and thrones served as both aesthetic achievements and instruments of elite authority, visually linking rulers to cosmological and supernatural concepts. Smaller-scale artifacts, including jade figurines, polished stone implements, and ceramic vessels, were employed in ritual activity, deposited as offerings, or displayed as markers of status. The consistent use of iconography, motifs, and symbolic forms across sites created a shared cultural and ritual language that reinforced social hierarchy and facilitated recognition of elite authority. Artistic production, distribution, and deposition were closely regulated, demonstrating the interdependence of craft specialization, ceremonial practice, and governance. Environmental adaptation and urban planning were critical to the functionality and sustainability of ceremonial centers. Elevated platforms, causeways, and raised fields mitigated flooding, facilitated movement, and supported agricultural production, ensuring that urban centers remained viable over long periods. Settlement placement balanced access to resources, transportation routes, and ceremonial visibility, reflecting a deliberate strategy to integrate natural and social landscapes. Water management systems, including canals and retention structures, supported both subsistence and ceremonial needs, providing surplus for labor mobilization and feasting activities. The careful integration of environmental, economic, and ritual systems demonstrates the holistic approach of Olmec urban design, in which physical, social, and symbolic considerations were mutually reinforcing. Population organization within ceremonial centers reflected the consolidation of social hierarchy and labor control. Elite residences were positioned strategically near ritual precincts, allowing oversight of both ceremonial activity and resource allocation. Peripheral residential areas accommodated artisans, farmers, and laborers, who contributed to both production and ritual support while remaining subordinate to elite authority. The deliberate spatial hierarchy facilitated the coordination of labor, management of economic surplus, and maintenance of social order. Repeated patterns of settlement organization across multiple centers indicate the replication of successful models of governance, ensuring both stability and cohesion within the Olmec cultural sphere. Trade and interregional exchange reinforced the prominence of ceremonial centers. The distribution of jade, obsidian, magnetite, and marine shells facilitated the movement of ritual and prestige goods, consolidating elite authority and supporting ideological cohesion. Secondary and tertiary sites participated in these networks, adopting Olmec iconography, ceremonial forms, and material culture, contributing to a standardized cultural framework. The integration of economic, ritual, and symbolic exchange ensured that ceremonial centers functioned not only as local hubs of power, but also as nodes in a broader regional system of influence. This networked approach amplified Olmec authority, enabling the civilization to project cultural and ideological power over a wide geographic area. The refinement of ceremonial centers during this period exemplifies the integration of political, ritual, and economic systems within Olmec society. Monumental architecture, standardized ritual practice, centralized governance, and interregional trade formed an interconnected system that sustained elite authority and cultural cohesion. These centers provided the framework for social hierarchy, ideological continuity, and regional integration, allowing the Olmecs to maintain influence across both ecological and cultural boundaries. The developments of this period also set the stage for subsequent challenges and transformations, including demographic shifts, environmental pressures, and evolving cultural dynamics that would influence the later trajectory of Olmec civilization. Understanding the organization and function of Olmec ceremonial centers provides essential insight into how early complex societies coordinated labor, codified ritual, and projected authority. The deliberate integration of architecture, art, ritual, and economy demonstrates the sophisticated planning and administrative capacity of the Olmecs. By creating enduring centers of ceremonial and political activity, the Olmecs established models of governance and cultural expression that influenced successive Mesoamerican civilizations. The lessons of these centers illuminate both the practical and ideological foundations of early state-level organization and prepare the context for examining subsequent periods of transformation, decline, and legacy within Olmec history. The strategic centralization and refinement of ceremonial centers naturally transitioned to the next stage of Olmec civilization, the intensification of conflict, environmental pressures, and social change that would challenge the stability of the heartland and initiate patterns of regional transformation. The achievements of these centers set a durable framework, yet their continued function depended on adaptive responses to internal and external stresses, foreshadowing the civilization's later evolution. The Olmec civilization, having achieved remarkable cultural, political, and economic sophistication during its peak, entered a phase of expansion and regional influence between approximately 400 and 300 BCE. This period is characterized by the diffusion of Olmec cultural, artistic, and ideological elements across a broad geographic range, extending from the Gulf Coast lowlands into interior valleys and adjacent highland regions. Archaeological evidence indicates that secondary and tertiary settlements adopted Olmec-style iconography, monumental architecture, and ceremonial practices, suggesting a deliberate propagation of cultural norms and elite authority beyond primary centers. The mechanisms of this expansion were not purely military. Instead, the Olmecs relied on trade, ritual standardization, and symbolic communication to project influence, establishing a network of interconnected communities that reinforced social hierarchy, political legitimacy, and cultural cohesion across diverse ecological zones. Monumental sculpture and architectural replication were central to the expansion of Olmec influence. Colossal heads, altars, thrones, and stelae, originally concentrated at La Venta and San Lorenzo, appear at secondary centers such as Tres Zapotes and Laguna de los Cerros, albeit at reduced scale. These objects carried complex symbolic meanings, linking rulers to supernatural authority, codifying elite identity, and asserting political dominance. Processional avenues, plazas, and elevated platforms were similarly reproduced at dispersed sites, enabling public rituals, ceremonies, and feasting activities that reinforced the ideological framework of the civilization. The deliberate placement and orientation of architectural elements suggest careful planning to integrate both functional and symbolic considerations, ensuring continuity in ritual performance and visibility of elite authority across the region. Trade networks continued to underpin the expansion of Olmec influence. Archaeological analysis shows the movement of jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland quarries, magnetite, and marine shells across long distances, linking peripheral communities to primary centers. These materials were transformed into ritual objects, ceremonial implements, and markers of elite status, disseminating both material wealth and ideological messaging. Secondary sites acted as production hubs, generating standardized objects for both local use and broader distribution. The coordination of labor, transportation, and distribution required administrative oversight, reflecting the organizational capacity of Olmec elites. By integrating economic, artistic, and ritual systems, the Olmecs projected influence effectively, fostering cultural cohesion and recognition of authority across extensive territories without the necessity of direct political conquest. Agricultural management remained critical to sustaining expanding Olmec populations and supporting the construction of ceremonial and civic structures. Archaeobotanical evidence indicates continued cultivation of maize, beans, squash, and manioc, supplemented by riverine and terrestrial resources. Innovations in irrigation, raised fields, and terracing allowed communities to maintain productivity in diverse ecological settings, ensuring surplus food for both urban populations and labor mobilization. The distribution of agricultural surplus reinforced social stratification, with elites controlling both production and allocation to support artisans, laborers, and ritual specialists. These practices demonstrate the interdependence of economic, social, and ceremonial systems, providing the foundation for the sustained expansion of Olmec influence and the integration of peripheral communities into the broader cultural network. Craft specialization and artistic production flourished during this period, serving both functional and ideological purposes. Workshops produced ceramics, stone tools, jade ornaments, and ritual objects in standardized forms, enabling consistent replication of Olmec iconography and ceremonial motifs. Monumental basalt sculptures required coordinated quarrying, transportation, and carving efforts, reflecting advanced technical knowledge and administrative oversight. Artistic standardization across dispersed sites reinforced elite ideology, facilitated recognition of authority, and supported the transmission of shared cosmological and ritual concepts. By controlling both production and dissemination of artistic forms, Olmec elites extended their influence over peripheral populations and ensured the durability of their cultural legacy. Residential and settlement patterns during the expansion phase demonstrate deliberate urban planning to support both social hierarchy and regional integration. Elite compounds were positioned near ceremonial precincts to facilitate oversight of ritual and economic activity, while peripheral settlements accommodated laborers, artisans, and agricultural producers. Secondary centers functioned as nodes within a network, linking smaller communities to primary centers through trade, ceremonial participation, and administrative coordination. This spatial organization facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas, ensuring that dispersed populations adhered to standardized ritual practices and recognized centralized authority. Repeated patterns of settlement hierarchy across multiple sites indicate the replication of successful governance models, contributing to the cohesion and stability of the Olmec cultural sphere. Ritual practice during this phase was integral to maintaining social cohesion and reinforcing elite authority. Processions, public ceremonies, and feasting were conducted in plazas and atop platforms, while caches of jade, stone, and ceramic offerings were systematically deposited beneath architectural features. Transformation motifs, including were-jaguar imagery and human-animal hybrids, continued to codify elite authority and mediatory roles between the human and supernatural realms. The standardization of ceremonial practice across primary, secondary, and tertiary sites ensured shared cultural understanding and facilitated participation in a cohesive ideological system. Ritual activity was closely intertwined with material production, economic distribution, and settlement planning, highlighting the integration of multiple societal dimensions in sustaining Olmec influence. Trade and ceremonial expansion were supported by environmental adaptation and strategic site placement. Settlements were established along rivers, terraces, and resource-rich areas, optimizing access to agricultural land, transportation routes, and ritual visibility. Water management infrastructure, including canals, raised fields, and retention structures, supported both subsistence and surplus production. The careful selection of settlement locations enabled efficient labor mobilization, distribution of resources, and participation in ceremonial life. Environmental adaptation, integrated with economic and ritual systems, exemplifies the Olmecs' capacity to manage complex societal networks across varied ecological contexts. The Olmecs also engaged in cultural diplomacy to reinforce expansion and influence. Secondary and tertiary communities adopted Olmec artistic conventions, ceremonial practices, and architectural forms, participating actively in the regional ideological framework. These communities contributed labor, materials, and ritual activity, strengthening social cohesion and recognition of elite authority. The replication of Olmec motifs, architectural layouts, and ceremonial practices across diverse locations facilitated the standardization of cultural expression and reinforced regional networks of influence. By projecting power through symbolic, artistic, and economic means, the Olmecs extended their authority beyond direct territorial control, creating a durable and widely recognized cultural sphere. Population movement, settlement hierarchy, and interregional interaction ensured that Olmec influence was not merely local, but extended across ecological and cultural boundaries. Communities in the Gulf Coast lowlands, highland valleys, and interior regions participated in shared economic, artistic, and ritual networks, maintaining cohesion and recognition of centralized authority. Secondary centers acted as intermediaries, facilitating the flow of goods, people, and ideas between primary hubs and peripheral settlements. This network structure allowed the Olmecs to consolidate influence effectively, maintaining both political and cultural authority across dispersed populations. The combination of strategic settlement, coordinated labor, standardized artistic production, and ritual integration reflects the sophistication of Olmec societal organization during this period of expansion. The achievements of this phase laid the foundation for subsequent developments in Olmec society, including the refinement of governance structures, the continuation of artistic innovation, and the eventual adaptation to internal and external challenges. By integrating ceremonial, economic, and artistic systems across an expanding geographic range, the Olmecs established a model of cultural influence that would inform the organization of later Mesoamerican civilizations. Understanding this phase is essential for comprehending how complex societies maintained cohesion, projected authority, and sustained regional networks over time. The expansion of Olmec influence, through trade, ritual standardization, and cultural dissemination, naturally transitions to the next phase of their civilization: the elaboration of governance, codification of elite authority, and intensification of artistic and ceremonial achievements. These developments would define the civilization's later stages, establishing enduring patterns that shaped Mesoamerican history for centuries. During the Olmec expansion phase, the elaboration and centralization of governance became a defining feature of the civilization's political evolution. Between approximately 400 and 300 BCE, evidence from primary and secondary centers indicates that Olmec elites increasingly codified authority through both ceremonial and administrative mechanisms. Urban layouts, monumental architecture, and ritual precincts were carefully designed to reflect hierarchical social structures, emphasizing the proximity of elite residences to ceremonial centers and the separation of labor and artisan zones from governing spaces. Stratigraphic analysis and radiocarbon dating of construction phases suggest sustained oversight and investment in urban planning, underscoring the centrality of governance in maintaining cohesion across an expanding geographic area. These developments reveal that Olmec leaders were not only religious intermediaries, but also skilled administrators, coordinating labor, resources, and ceremonial activity to reinforce both political authority and social stability. Ceremonial centralization was closely intertwined with political authority. Public plazas, processional avenues, elevated platforms, and monumental sculptures served as focal points for elite oversight and ritual enactment. The strategic placement of thrones, altars, and caches within these centers emphasized the mediation of rulers between human society and the supernatural. Transformation imagery, particularly were-jaguar motifs and depictions of human-animal hybrids, continued to codify elite status and cosmological significance. The repetition of these motifs across sites standardized ceremonial language and reinforced recognition of authority, creating a unified ideological framework across dispersed communities. Ritual centralization ensured that both primary and secondary populations participated in the same ceremonial system, maintaining cohesion and reinforcing the legitimacy of the Olmec elite. Economic integration underpinned this centralization. Archaeological evidence shows that elites controlled access to resources, agricultural surplus, and craft production, facilitating the organization of labor for monumental construction, ritual activity, and trade. Surplus production of maize, beans, squash, and manioc, supported by advanced irrigation and raised field agriculture, allowed for the sustenance of both urban populations and specialized artisans. Workshops associated with ceremonial centers produced standardized jade, basalt, and ceramic objects, ensuring the consistent transmission of both material wealth and ideological symbols. The regulation of resources and the coordination of labor across dispersed settlements reflect sophisticated administrative oversight, linking economic production directly to political and ceremonial authority. Secondary and tertiary centers played a critical role in consolidating governance. Settlements such as Tres Zapotes and Laguna de los Cerros acted as intermediaries between the primary ceremonial centers and peripheral communities, participating in production, ritual activity, and the redistribution of goods. These centers maintained architectural and artistic conformity with the Olmec heartland, replicating plazas, platforms, and monumental sculptures on a slightly smaller scale. Standardized iconography and ritual practices ensured that peripheral populations recognized elite authority and participated in cohesive ceremonial networks. The administrative and ceremonial integration of these settlements reflects a deliberate strategy of governance designed to extend influence, maintain cohesion, and reinforce social hierarchies across a broad and ecologically diverse region. Artistic production was both a medium and a tool of governance. Colossal heads, stelae, altars, and ceremonial objects communicated elite authority and codified ritual knowledge. These objects were strategically placed within ceremonial centers to assert visibility, reinforce hierarchy, and transmit cosmological concepts. Smaller-scale jade, stone, and ceramic artifacts were standardized and distributed throughout regional networks, ensuring that secondary and tertiary communities adopted Olmec cultural conventions. The coordination of artistic production across multiple sites demonstrates the integration of craft specialization, economic management, and political oversight. By controlling both material and symbolic production, Olmec elites maintained influence over dispersed populations and reinforced social cohesion throughout the cultural sphere. Environmental management remained central to governance during this period. Strategic site selection, raised fields, terraces, and water management systems supported both agricultural productivity and urban stability. Elevated platforms and causeways facilitated access, visibility, and movement within ceremonial centers, while canals and retention structures enabled irrigation and surplus generation. Coordination of these environmental interventions required administrative oversight, labor mobilization, and sustained planning. By integrating ecological management with ceremonial and political objectives, the Olmecs ensured the long-term viability of their settlements and the continuity of elite authority. This holistic approach exemplifies the sophistication of Olmec governance, in which natural, social, and ideological systems were mutually reinforcing. Population organization illustrates the practical implementation of centralized authority. Elite compounds were consistently located near ceremonial precincts, facilitating direct oversight of ritual activity, resource allocation, and labor coordination. Peripheral residential zones housed artisans, agricultural laborers, and support personnel, maintaining the functional base of urban centers while remaining subordinate to elite control. Settlement patterns across primary and secondary centers display consistent hierarchical structuring, suggesting deliberate replication of successful governance models. This spatial organization allowed for efficient mobilization of resources, supervision of ceremonial activity, and reinforcement of social stratification, ensuring the stability and cohesion of Olmec society during its period of regional expansion. Ritual codification reinforced both governance and social cohesion. Public ceremonies, offerings, and processions were organized according to standardized protocols, ensuring participation across primary and peripheral communities. Archaeological evidence of repeated iconographic motifs, ceremonial caches, and architectural alignments indicates a deliberate system of ceremonial control. Transformation imagery, including were-jaguars and anthropomorphic figures, reinforced elite legitimacy, linking human authority to supernatural power. These rituals provided a visible and participatory mechanism for maintaining hierarchical order, codifying political authority, and transmitting cultural knowledge. The synchronization of ritual practice across settlements strengthened social cohesion and reinforced recognition of elite power throughout the Olmec sphere. Trade and interregional exchange continued to support governance structures. The movement of jade, obsidian, basalt, and marine shells facilitated the distribution of ritual and prestige goods, reinforcing elite authority and standardizing symbolic communication. Secondary centers participated actively in these networks, producing, transporting, and displaying objects that reflected Olmec aesthetic and ideological norms. The integration of economic, ritual, and symbolic exchange allowed governance to extend beyond the immediate vicinity of primary centers, projecting influence and consolidating authority across a geographically dispersed population. By linking ceremonial, economic, and administrative systems, Olmec elites created a durable framework of governance capable of sustaining cohesion and cultural standardization. Technological and craft expertise underpinned the administrative and ceremonial systems of governance. Quarrying, carving, and transporting colossal basalt heads and altars required precise planning, organization of labor, and technical knowledge. Workshop production of jade, ceramic, and stone artifacts provided standardized material and symbolic resources for both elite display and ritual deposition. The combination of technical skill, administrative oversight, and ritual significance demonstrates the interdependence of craft production, governance, and ideological authority. By managing these systems, Olmec elites ensured that material culture reinforced political legitimacy, ceremonial coherence, and social stratification. The consolidation of governance during this period provided the structural foundation for enduring Olmec influence across Mesoamerica. Standardized ceremonial practices, spatial hierarchies, economic integration, and artistic uniformity allowed elites to maintain cohesion across dispersed populations and extend cultural influence without direct military conquest. These governance structures enabled the civilization to coordinate labor, manage resources, and project authority effectively, providing models for subsequent Mesoamerican societies. Understanding this period of political refinement illuminates the mechanisms by which early complex societies maintained stability, codified authority, and integrated diverse communities within a cohesive cultural framework. The centralization and codification of governance during Olmec expansion naturally transitioned to the subsequent phase of societal development. The intensification of artistic innovation, regional ceremonial standardization, and the emergence of challenges that would influence the civilization's trajectory. The administrative and ritual frameworks established in this period provided the necessary infrastructure for both continued cultural flourishing and adaptive responses to demographic, environmental, and social pressures that lay ahead. By approximately 300 BCE, the Olmec civilization had entered a period of intensified artistic and cultural achievement, marking the zenith of its influence across Mesoamerica. During this phase, The production of monumental sculpture, portable ritual objects, and complex iconography reached unprecedented sophistication, reflecting the consolidation of elite authority, ceremonial centralization, and regional integration. Colossal heads, altars, thrones, and stelae exemplified both technical mastery and symbolic complexity, serving as focal points for ritual activity, ideological expression, and social cohesion. These works not only communicated elite authority, but also codified religious and cosmological concepts, linking human governance with supernatural mediation. The refinement of Olmec artistic conventions during this period demonstrates the civilization's capacity to standardize and disseminate symbolic language across a geographically dispersed and ecologically diverse region. Monumental sculpture remained a defining element of Olmec culture. The colossal heads, carved from basalt transported from distant quarries, required significant logistical planning, labor organization, and technical expertise. Each head is distinguished by individualized facial features, headdresses, and proportions, indicating both representation of specific rulers and adherence to shared stylistic conventions. The placement of these sculptures within ceremonial precincts, atop platforms, and along processional avenues served multiple functions, asserting elite authority, providing focal points for ritual performance, and communicating ideological narratives to local and regional populations. The combination of scale, technical precision, and symbolic resonance exemplifies the integration of artistic production with governance and ritual practice, demonstrating the interdependence of multiple societal systems in sustaining Olmec cultural cohesion. Portable ritual objects also played a critical role in the dissemination of Olmec influence. Jade figurines, polished stone axes, ceramic vessels, and miniature altars were produced in standardized forms to convey consistent symbolic and ritual messages. These objects were widely distributed across primary, secondary, and tertiary settlements, ensuring participation in shared ceremonial practices and recognition of elite authority. The replication of motifs, iconography, and ritual function facilitated cultural cohesion across dispersed communities, while the technical skill demonstrated in carving, polishing, and finishing highlighted the specialization of craft production under elite oversight. By integrating artistic production with ceremonial function and administrative control, the Olmecs created durable systems of symbolic communication that reinforced both social hierarchy and regional influence. Architectural elaboration complemented artistic achievement during this period. Elevated platforms, mounds, processional avenues, and plazas were refined to accommodate increasingly complex ritual performance, public gatherings, and elite visibility. Architectural alignment often corresponded with cosmological observations, integrating astronomical knowledge with urban design and ceremonial practice. Caches of ritual objects, including jade figurines and basalt implements, were systematically deposited beneath architectural features, reinforcing both ideological and practical connections between rulers, communities, and the supernatural. The replication of architectural patterns across multiple centers ensured recognition of Olmec authority and facilitated participation in standardized ceremonial practice, strengthening cohesion across an expanding cultural network. Artistic motifs codified religious and political ideology. War-jaguar figures, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation imagery consistently appeared in monumental and portable forms, signaling elite mediation between human and supernatural realms. Repetition of these motifs across primary and secondary centers reinforced social hierarchy, standardized ceremonial practice, and communicated political legitimacy to dispersed populations. The codification of iconography and symbolic language enabled communities to participate in a cohesive ideological system, ensuring the continuity of Olmec cultural influence even in peripheral regions. The integration of artistic innovation with ritual, governance, and economic management demonstrates the holistic approach of Olmec society, in which multiple societal dimensions functioned in concert. Secondary and tertiary centers actively participated in the production and dissemination of artistic and ceremonial forms. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas replicated monumental architecture and produced standardized ritual objects, facilitating regional cohesion and recognition of elite authority. These settlements functioned as intermediaries between primary centers and peripheral populations, managing the distribution of symbolic, economic, and ritual resources. The replication of artistic and architectural forms across diverse ecological and geographic contexts ensured that Olmec influence remained both visible and operative throughout the region, extending the reach of political and ceremonial authority beyond the immediate vicinity of primary centers. Trade and resource distribution supported the flourishing of artistic production. The movement of jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland quarries, basalt from monumental sculpture, and marine shells from coastal zones provided materials essential for both ritual and display purposes. The coordination of labor for extraction, transport, and transformation of these materials required sophisticated administrative oversight. Agricultural surplus and organized labor supported artisans and ritual specialists, enabling sustained production of high-quality objects. This integration of economic management with artistic innovation highlights the interdependence of material, symbolic, and social systems in Olmec society, demonstrating how resources were leveraged to reinforce authority, ideology, and cultural cohesion. Population organization and settlement hierarchy facilitated both artistic and ceremonial production. Elite compounds were strategically located near ceremonial precincts, providing oversight of ritual activity, labor organization, and resource distribution. Peripheral residential zones accommodated artisans, laborers, and agricultural producers, ensuring the functional and symbolic infrastructure necessary for sustained cultural achievement. Standardized settlement patterns across primary and secondary centers allowed elites to replicate successful models of governance, labor mobilization, and ceremonial coordination, ensuring continuity of artistic, ideological, and administrative practices across the Olmec sphere. Environmental adaptation continued to play a central role in supporting artistic and ceremonial activity. Elevated platforms, terraces, and causeways mitigated flooding and facilitated movement within ceremonial centers, while irrigation canals, retention structures, and raised fields supported agricultural productivity. The integration of environmental management with artistic, ceremonial, and administrative systems allowed the Olmecs to sustain urban populations, mobilize labor for monumental projects, and maintain cohesion across diverse ecological settings. These strategies illustrate the Olmec's capacity to align natural, social, and symbolic systems in a manner that reinforced cultural resilience and regional influence. The intensification of artistic production during this phase also reinforced regional identity and long-distance interaction. Olmec-style objects and iconography appeared at distant sites, reflecting the success of standardized forms in transmitting ideological and cultural norms. Communities adopting these forms participated in the broader ceremonial and political framework, strengthening social cohesion and recognition of elite authority. The replication of motifs, architectural forms, and ceremonial practices across dispersed regions illustrates the sophistication of Olmec cultural strategy, in which artistic innovation functioned as a medium of governance, ideological dissemination, and social integration. The achievements of Olmec artistic refinement and ceremonial elaboration had lasting implications for Mesoamerican civilization. The codification of motifs, the standardization of ceremonial spaces, and the integration of craft production with governance provided models that influenced subsequent cultures, including the Zapotecs, Maya, and other early Mesoamerican societies. By demonstrating the interdependence of artistic, administrative, and ritual systems, the Olmecs established enduring frameworks for authority, cultural cohesion, and ideological transmission. These developments illustrate the sophistication of early complex societies and the mechanisms through which art, ritual, and governance were mutually reinforcing and maintaining both stability and influence. Understanding this phase of Olmec artistic and ceremonial intensification provides critical insight into the civilization's internal cohesion, regional influence, and long-term legacy. The integration of monumental and portable art, standardized ritual practice, architectural refinement, and administrative oversight demonstrates the holistic nature of Olmec society. These achievements prepared the civilization for both sustained regional prominence and the adaptive responses necessary to navigate environmental pressures, social change, and emerging challenges that would characterize subsequent periods of transformation. The refinement of artistic and ceremonial systems naturally transitions to the next phase of Olmec history, the emergence of environmental pressures, social restructuring, and regional shifts that would precipitate patterns of decline and reorganization. The cultural and administrative frameworks established during this period provided the structural foundation for both resilience and adaptation in the face of changing circumstances. As the Olmec civilization reached its peak artistic and ceremonial achievements, evidence emerges of emerging environmental pressures, social restructuring, and the beginnings of regional reorganization. Between approximately 300 and 200 BCE, archaeological records indicate shifts in settlement patterns, resource utilization, and ceremonial focus, suggesting adaptive responses to both ecological and demographic challenges. Sites that had once functioned as primary ceremonial and administrative centers, such as La Venta and San Lorenzo, display signs of reduced construction activity, modifications in architectural layouts, and evidence of reorganization within ceremonial precincts. These patterns reflect the Olmecs' efforts to maintain cohesion and ritual continuity while responding to environmental changes, including flooding, soil depletion, and shifting river courses, which influenced the sustainability of large population centers and agricultural production. Population movement and settlement realignment were central to these adaptive responses. Secondary and tertiary sites, such as Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas, increasingly assumed roles as regional hubs for production, ritual activity, and trade. The redistribution of populations from declining primary centers facilitated the maintenance of social networks, trade routes, and ceremonial observance across the cultural sphere. Residential areas in peripheral regions expanded, accommodating laborers, artisans, and agricultural producers, while elite compounds were strategically relocated to maintain oversight of resource allocation and ceremonial control. This reorganization illustrates the Olmec's capacity for spatial and administrative flexibility in the face of environmental and social pressures, ensuring continuity of influence and cohesion despite changing conditions. Environmental adaptation during this period was particularly pronounced. Archaeological surveys reveal modifications to agricultural infrastructure, including the construction of raised fields, terraces, and canals designed to manage water flow, prevent soil erosion, and sustain crop productivity. Settlements were strategically positioned on elevated landforms to mitigate flood risks, while causeways and elevated pathways facilitated movement between residential, ceremonial, and production zones. These interventions reflect an understanding of local ecology, hydrology, and resource management, demonstrating the Olmec's ability to integrate environmental knowledge into both urban planning and agricultural production. By adapting to changing environmental conditions, the civilization maintained a functional economic base while supporting ongoing ritual and administrative activity. Ceremonial practices continued to play a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion and legitimizing elite authority during this period of adjustment. Monumental sculpture, altars, thrones, and ritual caches remained focal points within ceremonial centers, while secondary sites increasingly replicated architectural and iconographic forms to reinforce regional identity. War-jaguar motifs, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation imagery continued to codify elite authority and cosmological mediation. Public rituals, processions, and offerings were systematically organized to engage populations across multiple settlements, ensuring continuity of participation in a shared ideological framework. The standardization of ceremonial practice allowed dispersed communities to maintain recognition of authority and adhere to cohesive cultural norms, even as primary centers experienced decline or transformation. Trade and resource distribution remained integral to sustaining Olmec influence during this period. Archaeological evidence indicates continued long-distance exchange of jade, basalt, obsidian, and marine shells, linking peripheral communities to secondary and tertiary centers. Workshops in these sites produced standardized ritual objects and ceremonial implements, facilitating the circulation of symbolic and material resources. The coordination of labor, transport, and distribution reflects the continued sophistication of Olmec administrative systems, ensuring that economic and ritual networks remained operational despite environmental or demographic shifts. Trade not only supported material needs, but also reinforced ideological cohesion, allowing elites to project authority and maintain social hierarchy across a region of considerable ecological diversity. Artistic production continued to flourish in the face of these challenges, reflecting both resilience and adaptation. Monumental sculpture, portable ritual objects, and iconographic motifs were replicated at secondary sites, preserving continuity in style, symbolism, and ceremonial significance. Variations in scale, material, or execution suggest local adaptations to resource availability, labor capacity, or site-specific ritual requirements. Despite these modifications, the fundamental symbolic language remained consistent, ensuring that elite authority and ideological continuity were maintained across dispersed populations. The integration of artistic production with environmental adaptation, administrative oversight, and ceremonial function highlights the interconnectedness of societal systems in sustaining Olmec cultural influence. Administrative coordination was essential in managing these shifts. Elites oversaw the redistribution of populations, allocation of agricultural and craft resources, and organization of labor for construction, maintenance, and ritual activity. Secondary and tertiary centers acted as nodes within a decentralized network, ensuring that regional governance, ceremonial practice, and trade remained operational despite the relative decline of primary centers. Residential and elite compounds were strategically positioned to facilitate oversight, maintain labor hierarchies, and support ceremonial infrastructure. These arrangements reflect an adaptive approach to governance, in which spatial reorganization, population management, and economic coordination allowed the civilization to sustain both social and ideological cohesion. Archaeological evidence indicates that demographic adjustments were accompanied by changes in social stratification and community organization. Labor specialization continued, with artisans, agricultural producers, and ritual specialists performing defined roles within both secondary and peripheral settlements. Elite authority was maintained through control of resources, ceremonial oversight, and symbolic communication, while participation in standardized ritual practices reinforced social hierarchy and cohesion. The replication of iconography, monumental architecture, and ritual objects across dispersed sites provided continuity of cultural identity and ideological recognition, ensuring that Olmec influence persisted despite structural and environmental challenges. Environmental pressures also influenced ceremonial spatial organization. Modifications to platform heights, plaza dimensions, and processional routes reflect adaptations to flooding, erosion, and changing settlement density. These changes were implemented without disrupting ritual observance, demonstrating a capacity for pragmatic adjustment within the ceremonial framework. Strategic placement of caches, altars, and thrones ensured that symbolic continuity was preserved, even as environmental and demographic variables necessitated physical and functional alterations. This interplay of adaptation and continuity illustrates the Olmecs' holistic approach to maintaining both material and ideological resilience. The persistence of Olmec cultural influence during this period is evident in the continuity of trade, artistic production, and ritual observance. Standardized iconography, architectural replication, and ceremonial protocols allowed dispersed populations to participate in shared practices, reinforcing elite authority and social cohesion. Secondary and tertiary centers assumed increasingly prominent roles in sustaining these networks, acting as regional hubs for production, ceremonial activity, and governance. The integration of administrative oversight, labor organization, and environmental adaptation ensured that the civilization maintained its cultural identity and influence across a broad geographic area, despite the challenges facing primary centers. This phase of environmental adaptation, social restructuring, and regional reorganization set the stage for the eventual transformation and decline of the Olmec heartland. While the civilization continued to exert influence through trade, ritual standardization, and artistic production, the relative reduction of activity at primary centers foreshadowed shifts in political and demographic patterns that would reshape the cultural landscape. Understanding these adaptive strategies provides insight into the resilience and limitations of early complex societies, illustrating how environmental, social, and administrative factors interact to shape the trajectory of civilization. The period of adaptive reorganization naturally transitions to the subsequent phase of Olmec history: the gradual decline of primary centers, the dispersal of populations, and the diffusion of Olmec cultural influence into emerging Mesoamerican societies. The strategies implemented during this phase highlight both the resilience and vulnerability of complex urban and ceremonial systems in the face of environmental and social pressures. By approximately 200 BCE, the Olmec civilization entered a phase characterized by social realignment, the decline of primary centers, and the diffusion of cultural influence across emerging Mesoamerican societies. Archaeological evidence from La Venta, San Lorenzo, and other heartland sites indicates a reduction in monumental construction, modifications to ceremonial precincts, and signs of population redistribution. These changes suggest that environmental pressures, including soil depletion, river course alteration, and flooding, combined with internal social and political dynamics, contributed to the diminishing centrality of primary urban hubs. Despite these challenges, the Olmecs' regional networks of secondary and tertiary settlements continued to maintain trade, ritual practice, and artistic production, ensuring that cultural and ideological influence persisted even as the heartland underwent transformation. The decline of primary centers is evident in the cessation or reduction of large-scale monumental projects. Colossal heads, thrones, and altars, once central to public ritual and elite authority, were no longer produced in comparable quantities. Architectural evidence shows that ceremonial platforms and plazas were maintained but no longer expanded with the same intensity or precision. Residential areas within these centers also indicate contraction or repurposing, reflecting the movement of populations to secondary settlements or smaller peripheral communities. This redistribution of population highlights a shift in the urban hierarchy, signaling both adaptive strategies and the limits of sustaining large centralized populations under ecological and social constraints. Secondary and tertiary centers assumed increased importance in maintaining Olmec influence. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas continued to produce standardized ceremonial objects, maintain plazas and elevated platforms, and facilitate ritual gatherings. These settlements acted as regional hubs, linking dispersed populations through trade, ceremonial participation, and administrative oversight. Artifacts recovered from these sites, including jade figurines, basalt implements, and ceramic vessels, reflect consistent adherence to Olmec artistic and ideological norms, demonstrating that cultural influence remained active even in the absence of dominant primary centers. The continuity of these networks underscores the resilience of Olmec's social and ritual systems during periods of demographic and environmental stress. Trade networks remained vital for sustaining social cohesion and economic stability. Archaeological analysis reveals continued movement of jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland quarries, magnetite, and marine shells across extensive distances. Secondary centers coordinated the production, transport, and distribution of ritual and prestige goods, ensuring that dispersed populations maintained access to essential symbolic resources. Trade not only facilitated economic integration, but also reinforced ideological continuity, allowing elites to project authority and maintain recognition across a geographically dispersed cultural sphere. The sustained operation of these networks demonstrates the Olmec's capacity to preserve social and ceremonial cohesion despite declining primary urban centers. Artistic production adapted to changing circumstances, reflecting both continuity and innovation. While the scale and number of monumental sculptures decreased, Portable ritual objects and smaller-scale art continued to convey Olmec iconography and cosmological concepts. War-jaguar motifs, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation imagery persisted in jade, stone, and ceramic objects, ensuring the transmission of ideological messages across secondary and peripheral sites. Variations in execution or material often reflect local adaptations to resource availability or demographic shifts, yet the fundamental symbolic language remained consistent. The continued production and dissemination of these objects illustrate the Olmecs' commitment to maintaining ritual, social, and political cohesion through material culture. Administrative coordination evolved to address the challenges of demographic redistribution and regional decentralization. Elite oversight became increasingly networked, with secondary centers functioning as nodes for resource management, labor coordination, and ceremonial standardization. Residential and ceremonial spaces were strategically organized to facilitate both oversight and participation, while peripheral settlements contributed labor, agricultural produce, and artisanal production. The replication of hierarchical settlement patterns and ceremonial structures across multiple sites enabled the Olmecs to sustain governance and ritual activity without relying solely on centralized urban hubs. This decentralized approach allowed the civilization to maintain cohesion and authority during a period of structural transition. Environmental pressures played a significant role in shaping the decline of primary centers. Flooding, soil depletion, and changes in river courses reduced agricultural productivity, challenging the sustainability of large urban populations. Archaeological evidence indicates that raised fields, terraces, and canals were employed to mitigate these effects, yet the scale of primary centers became increasingly difficult to maintain. Settlements were repositioned to optimize access to resources, with secondary and tertiary centers assuming greater significance in production, ritual activity, and governance. The interaction between environmental factors and social adaptation underscores the dynamic nature of Olmec civilization, demonstrating both the resilience and vulnerability of complex urban systems in the face of ecological constraints. Population mobility and social restructuring were central to maintaining Olmec cultural influence. Families and laborers relocated to secondary and peripheral settlements, ensuring continued participation in trade, ceremonial practice, and community organization. Elite compounds were repositioned within these sites to maintain oversight of labor, ritual, and resource distribution. Standardized settlement hierarchies and ceremonial precincts facilitated recognition of authority and reinforced cohesion across dispersed populations. These adaptive strategies illustrate the Olmecs' capacity to respond to demographic, environmental, and social pressures while preserving the structural and ideological foundations of their civilization. Ceremonial practice continued to function as a mechanism for social cohesion and elite authority. Ritual gatherings, offerings, and processions were maintained at secondary and tertiary centers, preserving participation in a shared ideological framework. Monumental and portable art continued to convey transformation imagery, linking elites to supernatural authority and codifying social hierarchy. Architectural modifications reflected pragmatic responses to environmental challenges while preserving the symbolic and functional integrity of ceremonial spaces. The continued observance of standardized rituals across dispersed communities ensured recognition of elite authority and facilitated cohesion during a period of structural decentralization. The decline of primary centers also facilitated the diffusion of Olmec cultural influence into emerging Mesoamerican societies. Iconographic motifs, architectural conventions, and ceremonial practices appeared in highland valleys, coastal plains, and interior regions previously peripheral to the Olmec heartland. Communities adopting these forms participated in the broader Olmec ideological and artistic framework, reinforcing the civilization's legacy even as direct control over primary centers waned. This diffusion illustrates the capacity of Olmec cultural, artistic, and ceremonial systems to extend influence beyond the confines of centralized urban hubs, shaping the development of subsequent Mesoamerican societies. The interaction between environmental pressures, demographic redistribution, and cultural continuity exemplifies the complex dynamics underlying the decline of Olmec primary centers. While the relative reduction in monumental construction and urban centrality marks a transformation in the civilization structure, the persistence of secondary centers, standardized ritual practices, trade networks, and artistic production demonstrates enduring resilience. The adaptive strategies implemented during this phase highlight both the strengths and limitations of early complex societies, providing insight into the mechanisms by which culture, authority, and social cohesion are maintained under changing ecological and demographic conditions. This period of decline and transformation naturally transitions to the next phase of Olmec history: the integration of dispersed populations, the persistence of ritual and artistic influence, and the emergence of successor societies that would carry forward Olmec cultural and ideological legacies. Understanding these processes illuminates the enduring impact of Olmec civilization on the broader trajectory of Mesoamerican history. As the Olmec primary centers continued to wane, the civilization's enduring influence became increasingly evident through the persistence of ritual practice, artistic motifs, and social structures in secondary and emerging communities. Between approximately 200 and 100 BCE, dispersed populations maintained Olmec traditions while adapting to local ecological, demographic, and political conditions. Archaeological evidence indicates that settlements such as Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas functioned as critical nodes for ceremonial activity, trade, and production, preserving both material culture and ideological frameworks. These centers became the primary custodians of Olmec cultural continuity, ensuring that artistic forms, iconography, and ritual practices were transmitted across regions even as the original heartland centers experienced decline. Secondary centers exhibited continuity in ceremonial architecture, including plazas, elevated platforms, and processional avenues, reflecting the replication of successful urban and ritual planning models from primary centers. Monumental sculptures, altars, and thrones continued to serve as focal points for elite authority and ritual observance, although production scale and frequency diminished compared to the peak of Olmec influence. The strategic placement of these architectural and artistic elements allowed communities to maintain visibility and recognition of leadership, integrating governance, ceremonial practice, and social cohesion. These architectural patterns demonstrate the intentional preservation of cultural and ideological standards, emphasizing the adaptability of Olmec societal structures to new environmental and demographic contexts. Trade networks remained instrumental in sustaining Olmec cultural influence during this phase. Archaeological studies reveal the continued movement of jade, basalt, obsidian, and marine shells between secondary centers, peripheral settlements, and emerging communities. Standardized production of ritual and prestige objects facilitated both economic exchange and symbolic communication, ensuring recognition of shared cultural norms across geographically dispersed populations. These networks supported both material and ideological needs, reinforcing social hierarchy, elite authority, and regional cohesion. The persistence of trade and material circulation underscores the capacity of Olmec systems to maintain influence beyond the primary centers, illustrating the interconnectedness of economic, ritual, and artistic domains in sustaining civilization. Artistic production remained a core mechanism for preserving and transmitting Olmec ideology. Portable ritual objects, including jade figurines, stone implements, and ceramic vessels, continued to feature standardized motifs such as were-jaguars, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation imagery. These motifs codified elite authority and cosmological mediation, allowing dispersed populations to participate in a shared symbolic framework. Variations in local execution and scale reflect pragmatic adaptations to resource availability, labor capacity, and settlement size, while the consistency of fundamental symbolic language ensured continuity of ideological recognition. Artistic production, therefore, functioned as both a medium of cultural transmission and a tool for reinforcing social cohesion in decentralized contexts. Administrative coordination adapted to the shifting settlement hierarchy. Secondary centers assumed responsibility for managing labor, coordinating ceremonial activities, and overseeing production and distribution of ritual objects. Elite compounds were strategically positioned to facilitate oversight, while residential zones supported artisans, agricultural workers, and ritual specialists. Settlement organization replicated hierarchical patterns established during earlier phases, ensuring recognition of authority and continuity of governance. The decentralized administrative model allowed the Olmecs to maintain cohesion and cultural influence even as primary urban hubs contracted or were abandoned, highlighting the resilience and flexibility of their societal structures. Environmental adaptation continued to shape Olmec society during this period. Modifications to agricultural infrastructure, including raised fields, terraces, and irrigation canals, enabled sustained crop production in diverse ecological zones. Settlements were strategically located to optimize access to water, fertile soil, and transportation routes, while architectural modifications mitigated environmental risks such as flooding and soil erosion. These interventions demonstrate the integration of ecological knowledge into urban planning, production, and ceremonial organization. By aligning environmental adaptation with social and ritual systems, the Olmecs maintained functional communities capable of sustaining cultural and ideological practices in decentralized contexts. Population mobility and social restructuring were critical in preserving Olmec influence. Families, artisans, and laborers relocated to secondary and peripheral settlements, participating in trade, ceremonial life, and production activities. Elite oversight was maintained through strategic positioning within ceremonial precincts, ensuring recognition of authority and coordination of communal efforts. Standardized settlement hierarchies and replicated ceremonial architecture facilitated both local administration and broader regional cohesion. These adaptations allowed the Olmecs to navigate demographic and ecological pressures while preserving essential social, political, and ritual frameworks. Ritual practice remained central to social cohesion and elite legitimacy. Ceremonial gatherings, offerings, and processions were conducted across secondary and peripheral sites, ensuring participation in a shared ideological framework. Monumental and portable objects reinforced the symbolic authority of elites and codified cosmological principles. Architectural spaces were adapted to local conditions without compromising their ceremonial function, preserving the continuity of ritual performance. The persistence of standardized ritual practices enabled dispersed communities to maintain recognition of authority, reinforcing cohesion and cultural continuity across the broader Olmec sphere. The diffusion of Olmec cultural influence during this phase is evident in the emergence of stylistic and ideological elements in neighboring regions. Iconographic motifs, architectural conventions, and ceremonial practices appeared in highland valleys, coastal plains, and interior regions previously peripheral to the Olmec heartland. These communities incorporated Olmec elements into local traditions, demonstrating both the adaptability and enduring appeal of Olmec cultural forms. The transmission of artistic, ritual, and architectural standards illustrates the civilization's lasting impact, as Olmec ideology and aesthetics continued to shape the development of subsequent Mesoamerican societies even after the decline of primary centers. The interaction between decentralization, environmental pressures, and cultural continuity underscores the complexity of Olmec societal adaptation. While primary centers experienced decline, the civilization's ideological, artistic, and administrative systems persisted through secondary centers, trade networks, and ritual observance. This phase highlights the resilience of social structures and the capacity for cultural transmission in the absence of centralized urban hubs. By maintaining standardized practices, coordinating labor, and preserving material and symbolic continuity, the Olmecs ensured the endurance of their influence across a changing Mesoamerican landscape. Understanding this period of adaptation and diffusion provides insight into the mechanisms by which early complex societies preserved identity, governance, and ideological coherence under conditions of stress. The Olmec strategies of decentralization, ritual standardization, and regional integration illustrate the balance between resilience and vulnerability in ancient civilizations. These processes laid the groundwork for the emergence of successor cultures, which would incorporate Olmec artistic, ritual, and ideological elements into their own social and political frameworks, ensuring the lasting legacy of the civilization. This phase of persistence and diffusion naturally transitions to the next stage of Olmec history, the final stages of transformation, the waning of direct influence in the heartland, and the broader impact of Olmec cultural heritage on emerging Mesoamerican civilizations. The strategies and achievements of this period provide critical context for understanding the enduring significance of Olmec civilization in the region. By approximately 100 BCE, the Olmec civilization had entered its final stages of transformation, characterized by the further decline of primary centers, the dispersal of populations, and the consolidation of cultural influence into successor societies across Mesoamerica. Archaeological evidence from La Venta, San Lorenzo, and other heartland sites demonstrates a marked reduction in monumental construction, a cessation of large-scale urban expansion, and the abandonment or repurposing of ceremonial precincts. Environmental challenges, including recurrent flooding, soil exhaustion, and shifting river courses, combined with internal social and political dynamics, contributed to the diminishing centrality of the Olmec urban core. Despite these changes, the civilization's ideological, artistic, and ritual traditions continued to be transmitted through secondary centers, peripheral settlements, and emerging cultures, ensuring that Olmec influence persisted beyond the decline of its heartland. The final phase of urban decline is evident in modifications to architectural layouts and the repurposing of ceremonial spaces. Elevated platforms, plazas, and causeways were maintained, but the scale and precision of construction decreased. Residential zones contracted or were relocated, reflecting the migration of populations toward more sustainable sites or secondary centers. Monumental sculpture, including colossal heads and altars, was produced less frequently, while ritual caches and smaller-scale artistic objects became more prominent. These patterns indicate both adaptation and contraction, as Olmec communities sought to preserve essential cultural and ritual practices while responding to ecological and demographic pressures that limited the viability of large urban settlements. Secondary and tertiary centers played an increasingly central role in preserving Olmec cultural continuity. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Cerro de las Mesas, and Laguna de los Cerros functioned as hubs for production, ritual activity, and social organization, maintaining standardized artistic, architectural, and ceremonial forms. Portable ritual objects, including jade figurines, stone implements, and ceramic vessels, continued to circulate across these networks, ensuring that dispersed populations participated in shared ideological frameworks. These centers facilitated the continued recognition of elite authority and the replication of Olmec cosmological and political symbolism, allowing the civilization's influence to persist despite the decline of its primary urban hubs. Trade networks remained vital to sustaining social cohesion and material production during this period. Archaeological evidence indicates ongoing exchange of jade from the Motagua Valley, basalt from distant quarries, obsidian from highland sources, and marine shells from coastal regions. Secondary centers coordinated the production, transport, and distribution of both ritual and prestige goods, integrating economic, ideological, and administrative systems. Trade not only supported material needs, but also reinforced symbolic communication and social hierarchy, allowing elites to maintain influence over dispersed populations. These networks exemplify the Olmec's capacity to preserve cohesion and cultural identity even as environmental and social pressures challenged the sustainability of large urban centers. Artistic production, though reduced in scale, continued to codify and transmit Olmec ideology. Transformation imagery, were-jaguar motifs, and anthropomorphic hybrids appeared in portable ritual objects and localized monumental works, preserving symbolic conventions established during earlier phases. Variations in material, scale, and execution reflect adaptations to available resources, local labor capacities, and settlement size, while the core symbolic language remained consistent. Artistic output thus functioned as both a medium of ideological transmission and a mechanism for social cohesion, ensuring that Olmec cosmological, political, and ritual principles endured across regions and generations. Administrative structures adapted to the realities of a decentralized and contracting civilization. Secondary and peripheral settlements assumed responsibilities previously managed by primary centers, including labor organization, ritual coordination, and production oversight. Elite compounds were strategically located within these settlements to maintain visibility and authority, while residential zones supported artisans, agricultural workers, and ritual specialists. Settlement hierarchies replicated earlier models on a smaller scale, facilitating the recognition of authority and the maintenance of governance despite the absence of dominant urban hubs. This decentralized approach exemplifies the Olmecs' capacity for flexible governance, enabling cultural continuity during periods of structural transformation. Environmental management continued to influence settlement patterns and agricultural practices. Raised fields, terraces, and irrigation systems were maintained or modified to support subsistence production and urban viability. Elevated platforms and causeways mitigated flood risks, while settlement relocation optimized access to fertile land and water resources. The integration of environmental knowledge into social, ritual, and administrative systems allowed Olmec communities to sustain functional settlements and preserve cultural practices despite ecological challenges. These adaptive strategies underscore the interconnectedness of environmental, social, and ideological systems in maintaining civilization during periods of decline. Population mobility and social restructuring were central to sustaining Olmec cultural influence. Families, artisans, and laborers relocated to secondary and peripheral centers, maintaining participation in trade, ritual, and production networks. Elite oversight was preserved through strategic positioning within ceremonial precincts, ensuring continued recognition of authority and coordination of communal activities. Standardized settlement hierarchies, architectural replication, and ceremonial organization facilitated both local administration and regional cohesion. These adaptations highlight the civilization's resilience and capacity for maintaining social and ideological continuity in the absence of dominant urban centers. Ritual practice continued to function as a key mechanism of social cohesion and elite legitimacy. Ceremonial gatherings, offerings, and processions were conducted across secondary and peripheral sites, enabling participation in a shared ideological framework. Monumental and portable artistic objects reinforced elite authority and codified cosmological principles. Architectural spaces were adapted to environmental and demographic conditions while preserving their ceremonial function. Standardized ritual practices ensured recognition of authority and cohesion across dispersed communities, allowing Olmec cultural identity to persist despite structural and ecological transformations. The diffusion of Olmec cultural influence during this period is particularly notable in the emergence of stylistic and ideological elements in highland valleys, coastal plains, and interior regions. Successor societies incorporated Olmec iconography, architectural conventions, and ceremonial practices into their own social and political frameworks. These communities participated in a broader Mesoamerican cultural network, integrating Olmec elements into local traditions while adapting them to regional needs. The transmission of artistic, ritual, and architectural standards highlights the enduring appeal and adaptability of Olmec cultural forms, ensuring their legacy in shaping subsequent civilizations. The interaction between decentralization, environmental pressures, and cultural continuity illustrates the complex dynamics of Olmec transformation. While primary centers experienced contraction and decline, secondary and peripheral settlements maintained governance, ritual, and artistic systems, preserving the civilization's ideological and cultural foundations. This phase highlights the resilience and adaptability of early complex societies, demonstrating how cultural identity, social cohesion, and symbolic authority can persist even amid environmental, demographic, and structural challenges. Understanding the final stages of Olmec transformation provides critical context for analyzing the civilization's enduring impact on Mesoamerican history. The mechanisms of decentralization, trade, ritual standardization, and artistic transmission reveal how Olmec cultural, political, and ideological systems influenced emerging societies long after the decline of the heartland. These processes illuminate the resilience, adaptability, and legacy of one of Mesoamerica's earliest complex civilizations, offering insight into the foundations upon which subsequent cultures built their social, artistic, and ceremonial traditions. The final stages of Olmec transformation naturally transition to the subsequent phase of historical analysis, the civilization's lasting legacy in Mesoamerican art, religion, governance, and urban planning. By examining the diffusion of Olmec cultural elements into emerging societies, we can trace the enduring influence of their achievements and understand the mechanisms by which early complex civilizations shaped the development of subsequent cultural landscapes. During the final decades of Olmec influence, roughly between 100 BCE and 50 CE, the civilization's legacy became increasingly evident through the integration of its artistic, ritual, and ideological frameworks into emerging Mesoamerican societies. Although primary centers such as La Venta and San Lorenzo had long ceased to function as dominant urban hubs, secondary and peripheral settlements continued to sustain Olmec cultural norms while simultaneously adapting to local environmental and social conditions. Archaeological evidence from Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and Cerro de las Mesas indicates that these settlements served as both custodians and transmitters of Olmec traditions, producing ritual objects, maintaining ceremonial spaces, and facilitating the continued circulation of artistic motifs and ideological concepts across the region. Monumental and portable art played a central role in this transmission. While large-scale sculpture declined, smaller altars, thrones, and ritual objects continued to carry were-jaguar imagery, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation motifs. These objects were widely distributed across secondary settlements, ensuring participation in a cohesive symbolic and ideological framework. Variations in material, craftsmanship, and scale reflect adaptations to local resource availability and labor capacity, while the continuity of core iconographic elements maintained recognizable Olmec symbolic language. Artistic production thus functioned as both a medium of cultural preservation and a mechanism for reinforcing social cohesion among dispersed communities. Secondary and tertiary settlements increasingly functioned as nodes for economic, administrative, and ritual coordination. Archaeological studies indicate that these centers oversaw the production of ritual and prestige goods, coordinated labor for construction and agricultural maintenance, and organized ceremonial activities. Elite compounds within these settlements were strategically positioned to facilitate governance, observation of ritual practice, and resource management. Residential zones accommodated artisans, agricultural producers, and ritual specialists, ensuring that functional, economic, and ideological systems remained integrated despite the absence of dominant primary centers. These arrangements reflect the Olmec's adaptive approach to sustaining complex social structures in decentralized contexts. Trade networks remained vital in supporting cultural continuity and cohesion. Evidence of long-distance exchange in jade, obsidian, basalt, and marine shells demonstrates that secondary centers coordinated the circulation of resources necessary for both material sustenance and ritual practice. Standardized production of ritual implements and symbolic objects facilitated recognition of authority and reinforced shared cultural norms. Trade acted not only as an economic mechanism, but also as a conduit for ideological transmission, connecting dispersed communities through participation in a cohesive ceremonial and symbolic system. These networks highlight the Olmec's capacity to maintain influence and cultural identity beyond the heartland. Environmental adaptation continued to shape settlement patterns and social organization. Raised fields, terraces, and irrigation systems supported sustainable agriculture, while elevated platforms, causeways, and terraces mitigated flood risks. Strategic site selection optimized access to water, fertile land, and transportation routes, allowing secondary and peripheral settlements to function effectively. These interventions demonstrate a sophisticated integration of ecological knowledge with urban planning, ceremonial organization, and social administration. Environmental management thus remained a critical component of Olmec resilience, facilitating the preservation of cultural and ideological practices in the face of ecological challenges. Population mobility and social restructuring were central to sustaining Olmec influence. Migration from declining primary centers contributed to the growth of secondary and peripheral settlements, allowing dispersed populations to continue participation in trade, ritual, and production networks. Elite authority was maintained through strategic positioning within ceremonial precincts, while standardized settlement hierarchies ensured recognition of social and political structures. This adaptive framework allowed Olmec communities to maintain social cohesion, governance, and ritual observance despite structural contraction and ecological pressures, demonstrating the civilization's capacity for organizational flexibility. Ritual practices remained the core mechanism for social cohesion and elite legitimacy. Ceremonial gatherings, offerings, and processions were conducted across secondary and peripheral sites, ensuring participation in shared ideological frameworks. Architectural modifications, such as platform adjustments, plaza expansion, and causeway construction, accommodated demographic and environmental changes without compromising ritual function. Monumental and portable artistic objects reinforced elite authority and codified cosmological principles, linking human governance to spiritual mediation. The persistence of these practices ensured that Olmec cultural identity and social cohesion were maintained even as structural transformations reshaped the heartland. The diffusion of Olmec cultural influence into emerging societies during this period is particularly evident. Highland valleys, coastal plains, and interior regions incorporated Olmec iconography, architectural conventions, and ceremonial practices into local traditions. Successor cultures adapted these elements to suit regional ecological, social, and political conditions while retaining recognizable Olmec motifs and ritual frameworks. This process facilitated the transmission of ideology, art, and ceremonial practice across a wide geographic area, demonstrating the enduring influence of Olmec culture on subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. The adaptation and integration of Olmec forms into new social contexts exemplify both the resilience and versatility of the civilization's cultural legacy. The interaction between decentralized administration, environmental adaptation, and cultural transmission highlights the complexity of Olmec societal dynamics during the final phase of influence. Although primary centers had declined, secondary and peripheral settlements maintained governance, production, and ritual functions, preserving the ideological and artistic foundations of the civilization. Trade networks and population mobility facilitated continued cultural integration, ensuring that Olmec influence remained operative across Mesoamerica. This phase demonstrates the capacity of early complex societies to adapt organizational, social, and symbolic systems to maintain cohesion under changing conditions. Understanding this period of diffusion and adaptation provides insight into the mechanisms by which Olmec culture shaped the development of subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. The continuity of artistic production, ritual practice, settlement hierarchy, and trade networks illustrates the persistence of social and ideological structures beyond the decline of primary centers. These processes not only ensured the survival of Olmec cultural identity, but also influenced the evolution of emerging societies, providing models for artistic, ceremonial, and administrative organization that endured for centuries. The strategies and adaptations implemented during this final phase naturally transition to the subsequent exploration of Olmec legacy. By examining the integration of Olmec cultural, artistic, and ideological frameworks into successor societies, it becomes possible to trace the enduring impact of Olmec civilization on the broader trajectory of Mesoamerican history. The examination of these legacies reveals how one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Americas shaped patterns of art, ritual, governance, and urban planning for generations to come. By approximately 50 CE, The Olmec civilization had largely ceased to function as a centralized political and urban entity, yet its cultural, artistic, and ritual influence persisted throughout Mesoamerica. Successor societies, influenced by Olmec traditions, began to integrate key elements of Olmec iconography, ceremonial practices, and social organization into their own developing frameworks. Archaeological evidence indicates that highland and lowland communities, including early Zapotec, Mix, Soke, and other regional cultures, adopted Olmec motifs, architectural conventions, and ritual protocols while adapting them to local ecological and demographic conditions. This phase marks the consolidation of Olmec legacy into the broader cultural landscape of Mesoamerica, illustrating the civilization's enduring impact even after its political and urban structures had largely dissipated. The diffusion of Olmec artistic traditions remained central to this process. War-jaguar imagery, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation motifs appeared prominently in the ceremonial art of emerging societies. Jade figurines, stone implements, and ceramic vessels continued to carry Olmec stylistic elements, serving as both ritual instruments and vehicles for the transmission of ideological concepts. The persistence of these motifs highlights the civilization's capacity to codify symbolic language that could be recognized and replicated across diverse regions and communities. This artistic continuity functioned as a mechanism for sustaining social cohesion, legitimizing authority, and reinforcing ritual practice, even as centralized Olmec urban centers had disappeared. Secondary and peripheral settlements remained pivotal in preserving Olmec cultural frameworks. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Cerro de las Mesas, and Laguna de los Cerros continued to serve as nodes for production, trade, and ceremonial activity. Architectural layouts replicated key features of earlier Olmec centers, including plazas, elevated platforms, and causeways, though at a reduced scale. Elite compounds were maintained within these settlements to ensure oversight of production, ritual organization, and resource allocation. Residential areas supported artisans, agricultural workers, and ritual specialists, demonstrating that decentralized social structures could preserve cultural, economic, and ideological continuity despite the decline of large urban centers. Trade and resource networks continued to facilitate both material and symbolic cohesion. Evidence of long-distance exchange in jade, obsidian, basalt, and marine shells indicates that secondary and peripheral centers coordinated the production, transport, and distribution of goods necessary for ritual and elite activity. These networks not only ensured economic stability, but also reinforced recognition of cultural norms, facilitated participation in shared ceremonial frameworks, and strengthened social and political authority across dispersed populations. Trade thereby functioned as both a practical and ideological tool, linking diverse communities into a cohesive cultural network that perpetuated Olmec influence. Environmental adaptation played a significant role in sustaining cultural and social structures during this transitional period. Archaeological studies reveal the continued use of raised fields, terraces, and irrigation systems to maintain agricultural productivity in ecologically diverse regions. Settlements were strategically located to optimize access to fertile land, water sources, and transportation routes. Architectural modifications, including elevated platforms and causeways, mitigated flooding and facilitated movement within ceremonial precincts. These environmental strategies demonstrate the Olmec's capacity to integrate ecological knowledge with social, administrative, and ritual systems, allowing cultural practices to endure even as population and political structures changed. Population mobility and social reorganization were central to maintaining Olmec legacy. Migration from declining primary centers contributed to the growth and reinforcement of secondary and peripheral settlements. Families, artisans, and ritual specialists relocated to sustain labor production, ritual activity, and trade networks. Elite authority was maintained through strategic positioning within ceremonial precincts, ensuring coordination of communal activities and recognition of leadership. Standardized settlement hierarchies, architectural replication, and ritual organization facilitated both local governance and broader regional cohesion. These adaptive strategies reflect the civilization's resilience and its ability to preserve social, political, and ideological structures under conditions of decentralization. Ritual practice continued to serve as a primary mechanism for sustaining cultural identity and legitimizing authority. Ceremonial gatherings, offerings, and processions were observed in secondary and peripheral settlements, allowing communities to participate in shared ideological frameworks. Architectural spaces, including plazas, elevated platforms, and ceremonial pathways, were adapted to local environmental conditions while preserving their functional and symbolic integrity. Monumental and portable artistic objects reinforced elite authority and codified cosmological principles, ensuring that Olmec's social and ideological structures persisted across geographically dispersed populations. The integration of Olmec traditions into emerging Mesoamerican societies illustrates the civilization's enduring influence. High-quality craftsmanship, standardized iconography, and ritual practices were adopted by successor cultures, including early Zapotec centers such as Monte Alban, coastal mix, Soque communities, and interior highland settlements. These societies incorporated Olmec elements into their own developing political, social, and ceremonial frameworks, adapting stylistic conventions, religious motifs, and urban planning strategies to local ecological and demographic conditions. This process highlights both the resilience and adaptability of Olmec culture and its capacity to shape the development of subsequent civilizations across a broad geographic area. The interaction between decentralized administration, ritual continuity, and cultural diffusion underscores the complexity of Olmec's societal transformation during this period. Although primary urban centers no longer functioned as political hubs, secondary and peripheral settlements maintained governance, trade, and ritual coordination, ensuring the survival and transmission of Olmec cultural identity. Artistic production and symbolic communication reinforced cohesion, facilitated social hierarchy, and provided a shared framework for emerging societies to build upon. The persistence of these structures demonstrates the mechanisms by which early complex civilizations can exert long-lasting influence even after political decline. Understanding this final stage of Olmec influence provides critical insight into the civilization's long-term legacy. The continuity of artistic, ritual, and administrative systems ensured that Olmec culture informed the development of emerging societies, providing templates for urban planning, social organization, ceremonial practice, and symbolic communication. These contributions laid the foundation for the evolution of Mesoamerican civilization, influencing cultural patterns, artistic expression, and ideological structures for centuries. By examining this period, historians and archaeologists gain a clearer perspective on how early complex societies maintain influence through adaptability, decentralization, and the transmission of enduring cultural frameworks. The consolidation of Olmec influence into successor societies naturally transitions to the exploration of the civilization's enduring legacy in Mesoamerican history. By tracing the diffusion of Olmec artistic, ritual, and ideological traditions, it becomes possible to understand how one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Americas shaped subsequent cultural landscapes, influencing social structures, governance, and religious practice for generations to come. This enduring impact exemplifies the mechanisms by which cultural achievements outlast political and urban decline, securing a permanent place for the Olmecs in the historical trajectory of Mesoamerica. Between 50 CE and 150 CE, the Olmec civilization's direct political and urban presence had largely vanished from the Mesoamerican heartland, yet its cultural and ideological influence remained a defining feature across emerging societies. Archaeological evidence indicates that secondary and peripheral Olmec sites continued to function as custodians of ritual practice, artistic production, and social organization, transmitting traditions to successor cultures. Communities in highland valleys, coastal plains, and interior regions integrated Olmec iconography, architectural conventions, and ceremonial frameworks into local practices. This period illustrates the mechanisms by which Olmec culture maintained relevance and shaped broader Mesoamerican developments. Even in the absence of centralized Olmec authority, or urban hubs. Artistic continuity played a pivotal role in preserving Olmec identity and influence. War-jaguar motifs, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation imagery persisted in portable ritual objects, small-scale altars, and localized monumental works. These artistic expressions codified cosmological principles, social hierarchies, and elite authority, allowing dispersed populations to participate in a shared symbolic and ideological framework. Variations in material, craftsmanship, and scale reflect adaptations to local resources and demographic conditions, while the fundamental iconographic language remained consistent. Through this medium, Olmec culture continued to assert its presence and shape the ceremonial and social norms of emerging Mesoamerican societies. Secondary and tertiary settlements remained central to cultural transmission during this period. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Cerro de las Mesas, and Laguna de los Cerros functioned as hubs for production, trade, and ceremonial coordination. Architectural layouts preserved key features of Olmec centers, including plazas, elevated platforms, and causeways, albeit at a smaller scale. Elite compounds within these settlements facilitated governance, oversight of ritual activity, and management of production. Residential areas supported artisans, agricultural workers, and ritual specialists, ensuring that functional, economic, and ideological systems remained integrated. These arrangements reflect a decentralized approach that preserved Olmec cultural continuity despite the absence of dominant urban centers. Trade networks continued to reinforce Olmec influence across a geographically dispersed landscape. Long-distance exchange of jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland quarries, basalt from distant sources, and marine shells from coastal regions facilitated both economic stability and ideological cohesion. Secondary centers coordinated the production, transport, and distribution of ritual and prestige goods, ensuring participation in shared ceremonial frameworks. Trade served as a conduit for both material resources and symbolic communication, linking dispersed communities into an integrated cultural network. These networks exemplify the Olmec's capacity to maintain influence beyond political and urban decline, highlighting the interconnectedness of economic, artistic, and ritual systems. Environmental adaptation continued to shape settlement patterns and social organization. Archaeological studies reveal the strategic placement of settlements to optimize access to fertile land, water, and transportation routes. Raised fields, terraces, and irrigation systems supported sustainable agriculture, while elevated platforms and causeways mitigated the risk of flooding and facilitated movement within ceremonial precincts. These environmental strategies allowed secondary and peripheral settlements to function effectively, preserving cultural and ritual practices while maintaining social cohesion. The integration of ecological knowledge into urban planning, production, and ceremonial organization exemplifies the Olmec's holistic approach to sustaining civilization under changing conditions. Population mobility and social restructuring were essential to maintaining Olmec legacy during this period. Families, artisans, and ritual specialists migrated from declining primary centers to secondary and peripheral settlements, sustaining labor, production, and ceremonial networks. Elite authority was maintained through strategic placement within ceremonial precincts, ensuring coordination of communal activities and recognition of leadership. Standardized settlement hierarchies, replicated architectural forms, and ceremonial organization facilitated local governance and regional cohesion. These adaptive strategies underscore the civilization's resilience, allowing social, political, and ideological structures to persist despite urban decline and decentralization. Ritual practice remained a cornerstone of cultural continuity and social cohesion. Ceremonial gatherings, offerings, and processions were conducted across secondary and peripheral settlements, enabling participation in a shared ideological framework. Architectural modifications, such as adjustments to platform height, plaza dimensions, and processional routes, accommodated environmental and demographic changes without compromising ritual function. Monumental and portable artistic objects reinforced elite authority, codified cosmological principles, and connected human governance to spiritual mediation. The persistence of standardized ritual practices ensured that Olmec cultural identity and social cohesion were maintained across geographically dispersed communities. The diffusion of Olmec traditions into emerging Mesoamerican societies during this period is particularly evident in the adoption of artistic, architectural, and ceremonial elements by early Zapotec, Mix, Soque, and other regional cultures. These societies incorporated Olmec motifs, urban planning strategies, and ritual conventions into local frameworks, adapting them to regional ecological and social contexts. This process facilitated both the transmission of ideology and the continuity of symbolic communication, ensuring that Olmec cultural influence persisted even as the original heartland centers had largely disappeared. The enduring integration of Olmec elements into successor societies highlights the civilization's long-term impact on the evolution of Mesoamerican civilization. The interaction between decentralized administration, ritual continuity, and cultural diffusion exemplifies the complex dynamics underlying Olmec legacy. Secondary and peripheral settlements preserved governance, trade, and ritual coordination, while artistic and ceremonial practices reinforced social hierarchy and ideological cohesion. These mechanisms allowed Olmec culture to maintain relevance and influence in a rapidly changing landscape, shaping emerging societies and informing their political, social, and ceremonial structures. This period demonstrates the capacity of early complex civilizations to exert lasting cultural influence even in the absence of centralized urban and political authority. Understanding the persistence and diffusion of Olmec culture during this period provides insight into the mechanisms by which early civilizations transmit identity, authority, and ideology across generations and regions. The continuity of artistic production, ritual observance, settlement hierarchy, and trade networks ensured that Olmec traditions influenced successive Mesoamerican societies. These processes not only preserved cultural identity, but also laid the foundation for the development of complex social, political, and ceremonial systems that would define the region for centuries. By examining this phase, historians gain a clearer perspective on how early civilizations shape long-term cultural trajectories and maintain influence beyond the lifespan of centralized political structures. The final stages of Olmec influence naturally transition to an analysis of the civilization's enduring legacy, focusing on the integration of its artistic, ritual, and ideological frameworks into the broader Mesoamerican historical continuum. By tracing the diffusion and adaptation of Olmec culture, it becomes possible to understand the lasting impact of one of the America's earliest complex societies and the mechanisms by which its achievements shaped the social, artistic, and ceremonial foundations of subsequent civilizations. By approximately 150 CE, the Olmec civilization had ceased to exist as a politically centralized entity, yet its cultural, artistic, and ideological legacies continued to resonate across Mesoamerica. The final phase of Olmec influence is best understood not as a period of decline, but as a transition in which the civilization's achievements were transmitted, adapted, and integrated into the practices of emerging societies. Archaeological evidence from secondary and peripheral sites such as Tres Zapotes, Cerro de las Mesas, and Laguna de los Cerros illustrates the mechanisms by which Olmec traditions were maintained and diffused. These settlements acted as repositories of ritual knowledge, artistic conventions, and social organization, allowing successor cultures to inherit and adapt Olmec innovations even as direct urban and political control disappeared. Artistic legacy remains central to Olmec cultural influence. War-jaguar motifs, anthropomorphic hybrids, and transformation imagery continued to appear in portable ritual objects, small-scale monuments, and localized ceremonial architecture. These motifs codified cosmological principles, social hierarchies, and elite authority, providing a recognizable symbolic framework that could be replicated and adapted by other societies. Variations in execution and material reflect responses to local resources, demographic conditions, and labor availability, but the fundamental iconographic language persisted. By transmitting these artistic conventions across regions, the Olmecs ensured the survival and continued relevance of their ideological and social structures. Secondary and peripheral settlements functioned as the primary custodians of Olmec traditions during this period. Architectural layouts retained key elements of primary centers, including plazas, elevated platforms, and causeways, though on a smaller scale. Elite compounds were maintained to oversee ritual activities, production processes, and resource distribution, ensuring continuity of governance and ceremonial coordination. Residential areas supported artisans, agricultural producers, and ritual specialists, integrating economic, social, and ideological systems. These decentralized settlements allowed Olmec culture to persist, demonstrating the capacity of complex societies to sustain identity and influence even in the absence of dominant urban centers. Trade networks continued to facilitate the dissemination of Olmec cultural and material influence. Archaeological evidence indicates ongoing long-distance exchange of jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland quarries, basalt from distant sources, and marine shells from coastal regions. Secondary settlements coordinated the production, transport, and distribution of both practical and ceremonial goods. Trade reinforced social cohesion, supported elite authority, and enabled participation in shared ideological frameworks. These networks ensured that dispersed populations remained culturally integrated, preserving Olmec influence across a broad geographic region. Environmental adaptation remained integral to the survival of Olmec cultural systems. Strategic settlement placement optimized access to fertile land, water, and transportation routes, while raised fields, terraces, and irrigation systems sustained agricultural production. Elevated platforms and causeways mitigated the risks of flooding and facilitated movement within ceremonial precincts. By integrating environmental management with social and ritual structures, the Olmecs demonstrated an advanced understanding of ecological planning, ensuring that their cultural and ideological practices could endure under changing conditions. This strategic approach to settlement and resource management allowed for the continued relevance of Olmec traditions in successor societies. Population mobility and social restructuring facilitated the preservation and dissemination of Olmec culture. As primary centers declined, families, artisans, and ritual specialists migrated to secondary and peripheral settlements, sustaining labor, production, and ceremonial activity. Elite authority was maintained through strategic positioning within ceremonial precincts, while standardized settlement hierarchies enabled recognition of leadership and coordination of communal functions. These adaptive strategies illustrate the resilience of Olmec's social and ideological structures, allowing them to endure and shape emerging societies across Mesoamerica. Ritual practice continued to serve as a mechanism for social cohesion and ideological transmission. Ceremonial gatherings, offerings, and processions were conducted at secondary and peripheral sites, preserving participation in shared cosmological frameworks. Architectural spaces were modified to suit local environmental conditions while maintaining their ceremonial function. Monumental and portable artistic objects reinforced elite authority and codified cosmological principles, ensuring continuity of social organization and ideological coherence. The maintenance of standardized ritual practice enabled Olmec cultural identity to persist even as political and urban structures evolved or disappeared. The integration of Olmec traditions into successor societies illustrates the civilization's enduring influence. Early Zapotec, Mix, Soque, and other Mesoamerican cultures adopted Olmec motifs, urban planning concepts, and ritual practices, adapting them to local social, ecological, and political conditions. These adaptations facilitated the spread of Olmec ideology, ensuring that its artistic, ceremonial, and organizational frameworks influenced the development of new societies. The diffusion of Olmec culture during this period highlights both its resilience and its capacity to shape the evolution of Mesoamerican civilization over subsequent centuries. The interplay between decentralized administration, ritual continuity, and cultural diffusion during this final phase demonstrates the mechanisms by which Olmec influence persisted beyond the lifespan of centralized urban centers. Secondary and peripheral settlements preserved governance, production, and ceremonial coordination, while artistic and symbolic practices reinforced social cohesion, hierarchy, and ideological recognition. Trade networks connected dispersed communities, facilitating the circulation of both material resources and ideological symbols. These integrated systems ensured that Olmec culture remained relevant and influential, providing models for organization, artistic expression, and ritual practice in emerging societies. Examining this final phase of Olmec influence provides insight into the civilization's long-term legacy. The continuity of artistic production, ritual observance, settlement hierarchies, and trade networks enabled the Olmecs to shape the social, political, and ceremonial foundations of subsequent Mesoamerican cultures. These processes illustrate how early complex societies can maintain influence and transmit cultural identity even after the decline of centralized political and urban structures. Understanding these mechanisms sheds light on the enduring significance of Olmec civilization in the broader trajectory of Mesoamerican history. The consolidation and adaptation of Olmec achievements naturally transition to a discussion of the civilization's overarching legacy. By analyzing the transmission of artistic, ritual, and ideological frameworks into later societies, it becomes possible to trace the long-term impact of Olmec civilization on Mesoamerican culture. This enduring influence encompasses urban planning, ceremonial practice, artistic conventions, and social organization, demonstrating how one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Americas shaped the cultural landscape for generations to come. By 150 CE, the Olmec civilization had effectively disappeared as a centralized urban and political entity, yet its enduring influence was firmly established across the developing societies of Mesoamerica. The final phase of Olmec legacy is best understood as a period of transmission and transformation, in which the civilization's artistic, ritual, and ideological frameworks were absorbed, adapted, and integrated into emerging cultures. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that the motifs, practices, and organizational strategies developed by the Olmecs continued to inform the social, ceremonial, and political life of successor societies. Through secondary settlements, trade networks, ritual practices, and artistic production, Olmec culture persisted, leaving a durable imprint that shaped Mesoamerican civilization for centuries to come. Artistic and symbolic transmission remained a central vehicle for Olmec influence. Jaguar imagery, transformation motifs, and anthropomorphic hybrids persisted in portable objects, small-scale monuments, and localized ceremonial architecture. These objects codified principles of elite authority, cosmology, and ritual observance, providing successor societies with a recognizable framework for social and ceremonial organization. Variations in execution, scale, and material demonstrate regional adaptation, while the continuity of core iconographic elements preserved Olmec's symbolic language. The persistence of these motifs enabled dispersed communities to participate in a cohesive ideological network, reinforcing cultural identity and continuity across generations. Secondary and peripheral settlements continued to act as hubs of Olmec influence. Sites such as Tres Zapotes, Cerro de las Mesas, and Laguna de los Cerros functioned as centers of production, trade, and ceremonial activity, ensuring the survival of governance, ritual coordination, and material culture. Architectural layouts maintained plazas, elevated platforms, and causeways, though often at reduced scales. Elite compounds oversaw production, ritual organization, and resource distribution, while residential zones housed artisans, agricultural workers, and ritual specialists. These decentralized networks illustrate the Olmec's ability to preserve social, political, and ceremonial systems beyond the decline of primary urban centers, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of their civilization. Trade networks continued to facilitate both material and cultural cohesion. Archaeological studies reveal long-distance exchange of jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from highland sources, basalt from distant quarries, and marine shells from coastal regions. These exchanges ensured that secondary and peripheral settlements maintained access to resources necessary for ritual, economic, and artistic production. Trade also reinforced social hierarchies, facilitated participation in shared ideological frameworks, and transmitted symbolic norms across geographically dispersed populations. Through these mechanisms, the Olmecs exerted influence over successor societies, shaping cultural, economic, and social organization even in the absence of centralized authority. Environmental adaptation remained critical to sustaining Olmec cultural systems. Strategic settlement placement optimized access to fertile land, water, and transportation routes, while raised fields, terraces, and irrigation systems supported agricultural productivity. Elevated platforms, causeways, and ceremonial precincts were modified to mitigate flooding and facilitate movement. These strategies demonstrate an advanced integration of ecological knowledge with social, administrative, and ritual organization, allowing Olmec cultural practices to endure under shifting environmental conditions. Environmental adaptation, thus, served as both a practical and ideological foundation for the persistence of Olmec influence. Population mobility and social restructuring facilitated the preservation and dissemination of Olmec culture. Migration from declining primary centers to secondary and peripheral settlements ensured continuity of labor, production, and ritual networks. Elite authority was maintained through strategic placement within ceremonial precincts, enabling coordination of communal activities and recognition of leadership. Standardized settlement hierarchies, architectural replication, and ceremonial organization reinforced both local governance and regional cohesion. These adaptive strategies exemplify the Olmec's resilience, ensuring the survival and transmission of social, political, and ideological structures across time and space. Ritual practice continued to anchor social cohesion and ideological continuity. Ceremonial gatherings, offerings, and processions persisted in secondary and peripheral settlements, enabling communities to participate in a shared cosmological framework. Architectural modifications accommodated local environmental and demographic conditions while preserving ceremonial integrity. Monumental and portable artistic objects reinforced elite authority, codified cosmological principles, and linked human governance to spiritual mediation. The continuity of ritual practice ensured that Olmec cultural identity and social cohesion endured despite the decline of centralized urban and political systems. The integration of Olmec traditions into successor societies illustrates the civilization's enduring and transformative influence. Early Zapotec, Mix, Soque, and other Mesoamerican cultures adopted Olmec artistic motifs, ceremonial practices, and urban planning principles, adapting them to local ecological, social, and political contexts. These adaptations facilitated the spread of ideology, reinforced social hierarchies, and ensured that Olmec cultural contributions persisted beyond the life of the original civilization. This process highlights both the resilience and versatility of Olmec culture and its capacity to shape the trajectory of subsequent Mesoamerican development. The final consolidation of Olmec achievements demonstrates the interplay of decentralized administration, ritual continuity, artistic production, and trade networks. Secondary and peripheral settlements preserved governance, production, and ceremonial coordination, while artistic and symbolic practices reinforced social cohesion, hierarchy, and ideological recognition. Trade networks connected dispersed communities, facilitating the circulation of material resources and symbolic norms. Through these mechanisms, Olmec culture remained relevant and influential, providing models for organization, artistic expression, ritual practice, and social cohesion that would inform emerging societies for centuries. Understanding this final phase of Olmec influence provides insight into the mechanisms by which early complex civilizations maintain identity, authority, and ideology across generations. The persistence of artistic production, ritual observance, settlement hierarchies, and trade networks enabled the Olmecs to shape the social, political, and ceremonial foundations of subsequent Mesoamerican cultures. These processes demonstrate how a civilization can exert lasting cultural influence even after the decline of centralized urban and political structures, securing a permanent role in the historical trajectory of a region. The legacy of the Olmecs is evident not only in the continuity of cultural, artistic, and ritual frameworks, but also in the broader development of Mesoamerican civilization. Olmec innovations in urban planning, ceremonial architecture, social hierarchy, and symbolic communication provided models for subsequent societies, influencing cities, governance structures, and religious practices across the region. The enduring presence of Olmec motifs, iconography, and ritual elements underscores the civilization's role as a foundational force in Mesoamerican history, shaping the trajectory of cultural evolution for centuries. By the conclusion of this period, it becomes clear that the Olmecs' most significant achievement was not merely the construction of urban centers or the creation of monumental art, but the establishment of enduring cultural, ideological, and social frameworks. Through strategic settlement, artistic innovation, ritual standardization, and trade, the Olmecs created systems capable of persisting beyond the lifespan of their political and urban structures. This enduring influence provides a framework for understanding how early complex societies can transmit identity, authority, and ideology across time, ensuring that their contributions continue to shape subsequent civilizations. The culmination of Olmec legacy transitions seamlessly into the broader historical understanding of Mesoamerican civilization. By tracing the diffusion, adaptation, and integration of Olmec cultural, artistic, and ideological frameworks, historians can observe how one of the earliest complex civilizations in the Americas established patterns of social organization, artistic expression, and ritual practice that shaped the development of successive societies. The Olmecs' enduring influence highlights the mechanisms by which cultural achievements outlast political decline, ensuring that the civilization's contributions remain central to the historical narrative of Mesoamerica.